So good morning, everyone. Hope everyone still has a little bit more energy. We're on the last day here. We're nearly there, but we've got a set of exciting talks in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we have the breakout practicum, and that should be pretty much it. So I think we can talk about what time we'll end, maybe later. We'll let you know when we expect to end, but we're expecting to end earlier than what the agenda says. So a recap of yesterday. Yesterday, we heard about all the unique configurations of E3SM, whether it was the single column model, DP Scream, RM, the MMF. We also heard from Peter Caldwell regarding the Scream model. And then we had a couple of talks regarding their human system coupling, which will actually continue this morning. In the afternoon, you got to try out the Zippy and the Z-Stash tools, which are unique to E3SM and are quite handy if you actually start using them. And so I encourage you to continue practicing if you didn't get a chance to do so yesterday. And then in the afternoon, we did, I think, one of the most complicated things, which was to make code modifications using Git to have some provenance about those changes and then to actually submit those simple simulations. But today we'll start off the set of lightning talks, as I've been calling them, with the human system coupling talk given by Qing, and then a series of science and technology talks, applications of the E3SM model, as well as some details about how we got where we are. Then Rob Jacob will provide an overview of testing and code review, especially for those who are considering doing some development. And then in the afternoon, we'll have breakout practicums. And so, as we mentioned yesterday, the atmosphere will be in this same room, the practicum. If you're interested in doing the land, it's in 3104, which is behind you. It's a smaller room behind you. And then if you are interested in doing the ocean and sea ice practicum, they're upstairs in 4202, and you can find, if you were interested in finding which rooms there are later on and you didn't have the slide, you can actually check the agenda, and the agenda should tell you where to go. Okay, before we get started, any questions? All right, if not, Qing from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab.
Thank you. All right, morning, everyone. My name is Qing at Berkeley Lab. I know this is the last day, everyone is tired, but I tried to convince you that I'm gonna talk about technical things, but also scientific applications that encourage you to think more about that, because ultimately you want to use E3SM for your research work, generating paper or maybe testing hypotheses, writing proposals. So my topic is coupled Earth system modeling with biogeochemistry. So the emphasis on the BGC interactions, and the group is very large and diverse because it includes multiple components of E3SM: land, atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, human, and this is a continuation of yesterday's HES discussion and lectures. So the motivation. So Earth system model has been used for a lot of purpose, but I think one of the major purposes is to inform climate mitigation strategy, and inform decarbonization strategy, and how to cool down the land surface temperature or the atmospheric temperature with a meaningful strategy. And so this is a adapted version from the IPCC report, but the most important message here is the CO2. So CO2 is a major reason. That's why we have 1 degree warming so long. Although we have cooling imposed by aerosol and clouds, but CO2 as a major greenhouse gas, that is a reason that why we have a high temperature and keep going. And so that's why BGC is important here, because BGC provides source and sink for the CO2. And if we decompose that, we'll get these information that majority of the CO2, of course, is coming from direct emissions of human activity, but also land use, that, for example, deforestation. And then the BGC plays a role here in the as green bars, you have land ocean BGC that provide a very important carbon sink. And so to remove CO2 from atmospheric CO2 pools, about quarter and quarter, 25% and 25% roughly for each component. So that's why it becomes a very important strategy. If we can increase the sink in a reasonable way, then we can probably mitigate the climate change just from a CO2 perspective. Of course, there are also methane and CO and NTO. But our today major topic is CO2. So this is I'm gonna go through from the very beginning that we build BGC features, and then we conduct the version 1 couple BGC experiments many years ago, and now we just finished the V2 BGC experiments, and the V3 is still just ongoing. So this is a V1 version. So this is a very high level introduction of the BGC features, but you can see here we have land and ocean. We have carbon cycle through the system, we have disturbance, almost everything. But the centric point is those arrows, so they provide feedback, BGC feedback. So if you have high CO2 concentration, you will see a response at land surface and ocean. And they also provide the modified source and sink turn and feedback to the atmosphere. So that is the component that we focus on. And also the science question we try to address, how to understand that feedback, how to understand the role of BGC, carbon and nutrient plays in this couple system. And so just zoom a little bit into the land surface, we can have a closer look at the BGC encoding in E3SM. So this is one of the version. We have multiple configurations. So this is called ECA configurations. But in general, we have CMP with carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle through the system. And the BGC reactions happening in the tree and also below ground and soil interaction between root and the bug soil. So you see there are many different pools and flux. They have interaction with each other. But the entry point is CO2. You see there is CO2 molecule on the top right. That's the entry point. And when the CO2 enters into the system, then it has to go toward along with nutrient cycle it, and then decompose in the soil and return CO2 back into the atmosphere. And the plant also has a return part of the CO2, photosynthetic CO2 back into the atmosphere, depending on the environmental condition. So this is how the land surface BGC plays a role here, as CO2 as a important point here for the interactions. And in terms of how to understand the BGC impacts, so there are a lot of very high volume of literature discussing, and I think most important metrics or the thing that we care about, we call them carbon concentration feedback and the carbon climate feedback. So this is from CIME 5 and CIME 6 experiments. So we have a lot of lines here, but basically 3 different configurations will decompose the system from the fully coupled understanding point to this carbon concentration feedback and carbon climate feedback components. So that's the difference between the blue line and the green line, and also the difference between the blue line and the red line. So it helps you to understand which part of the BGC interaction is contributing to the carbon sink in this case, and also the accumulated carbon stock in the system, in the land surface. And so V1 configuration, we have a lot of information here, but I wanted to focus on the most important message here is we already built a lot of BGC features and we have concept for you to use. So if you look to the right, we have those red arrows, control BCRC, BCRD, those are the important things. You can just use them, they're existing concept. So control means you just use a pre-industrial condition. There's no climate change, nothing. And BCRC, so you see there are two C there means constant. So B is the physiological effect of CO2, that's the carbon concentration feedback. And R is the radiative effect, that's the carbon climate feedback. So you can turn that on and off. If it's C, constant, then it's off. Okay, so then keep going, you have BCRD, so you can figure that out on your own. BC means you don't have the carbon concentration feedback, it's constant. But RD, R is the carbon climate feedback. It's diagnostic, so it's on, but it's not prognostic, it's diagnostic, meaning you have CO2 concentration as prescribed field that continues to grow and increase during historical period, and running into the future, you also have future prescribed CO2 concentration that imposes radiative effects so that you see the warming signal and all the BGC calculation were based on that warming signal. And so if you switch it, then you have BDRC, so you have CO2 concentration feedback, but you don't have the climate feedback. And also the full version is BDRD. Okay, so you can decompose, you can just subtract one simulation from the other, then you can figure out the difference, which is the contribution of CO2 concentration feedback versus the CO2 climate feedback, carbon climate feedback, contribute to the climate change, that which is simulated by this BDRD. Okay, and the lower panel is just another version. You also have different configuration that you can just pick and use based on your scientific purpose. But you see, this is not complete because it's still diagnostic. You can simulate CO2 concentration as an emission change, anthropogenic emission, and also the land surface carbon sink and ocean and land surface carbon source and sink. And so that here we come to version 2. In version 2, here we have EPRP. So which is on top of BDRD. BDRD is all diagnostic. So you have CO2 concentration field prescribed. But you can also make use of this BPRP capability that you only need emission. So you don't need to prescribe CO2 concentration field and time series. The CO2 concentration is simulated based on the balance of the emission and the sink to land surface and ocean. Okay, so then in this case, you can also design your simulation as, let's say, BPRC, BCRP to figure out those feedback terms. But if you're combining these configuration, I think then you can design your own BGC experiments and to address your own science question. I think the capability is already there. Just need to think about how to innovatively make use of those features. And then the V3 is ongoing. We don't have a new configuration, but we do bring a lot of new features from land surface and also the ocean, a lot of ocean features and ocean BGC calibration as well. So this is just a continuation of V2. And the important message here is besides BCRC, BDRD, BPRP, you can also turn on and off features as you like. So for example, we turn on and off wildfire. I'm going to show an example here later. So you can then you can focus on the fire disturbance and the fire emissions, how they interact with the atmosphere, and what's the emission contribution of the CO2 concentration change, but also the atmospheric chemistry and the aerosols, everything. And a little bit diagnostics. So it just showcased the performance of V1. It's on the right. There are two columns on the far right, are two configuration of the BGC V1 simulation that we conduct, and compare with our other CIME versions, CIME models. In general, it outperform other models across all the metrics. So each row is a variable that we benchmark against. Biomass, burning area, basically all those carbon, water, energy, and surface climate variables. But remember, this is BDRD. So you have CO2 concentration as a very strong constraint on your simulations. So what happens if you make it freely adjustable by human emission and also by the land and the ocean carbon sink and source? So then this is the V2. So V2, we have BPRP. So if you take a look at if you focus on the purple column, which is the BAS model, that's our offline model that's driven by reanalysis surface climate and also the observed CO2 concentration. So you see that it performed very, very good because you have a very strong constraint on the environment. And then in the BPRP on the far right, you see the performance degree, which makes sense because there are a lot of more components that are freely changeable in the model. And so any change in the source and sink strengths will be contributing to the CO2 concentration and feedback to all those BGC calculations. So this is a very challenging thing to make sure that the couple simulation works for your case. So the strategy is then you need to pay more attention on the calibration. So specifically for the component that you pay attention to. and for the BPRP. And just one more sentence on this diagnostic. So although you looks like they are so different in terms of color, but they are relative difference. So we also care about the overall metrics. So the BPRP actually works pretty fine in terms of capturing those major metrics. And so case study, this is our V1 results that I show here is we analyze the neutron BGC impacts on the land atmosphere feedback. So we construct this feedback network. So we can include all the variables, but these are the important variables that we think at least we're interested in to look at. And we focus on the extratropical forest. And so you see there soil, land surface, and atmosphere. And they have arrows to connecting with each other. And the direction and the strength of those arrows, we call them feedback. So you have feedback direction and also feedback strength. And so this is BDRD. And so how do we calculate the direction feedback strength? We develop a package using information theory. So you can also use that as well in analysis, as long as you have a network. So you can calculate information entropy flow from one variable to the other. So this is pairwise calculation, for example, here from soil temperature to GBP, soil temperature to latent heat, all those different connections. It could be not significant. That means the connection doesn't exist or the feedback directional feedback doesn't exist, or it can be very strong. So you see, this is a land component, atmosphere component, and also the entire network of that land surface, land atmosphere coupling system. The change of the relative coupling strengths of connectivity throughout the time. So you don't see that much of that temporal decline or increasing trend of this coupling, but you do see the strengths change a lot. So that's the coupling connectivity doesn't change that much, but strengths change a lot. Here, we also make use of those BDRD, BDRC, and BCRD, if you still remember, is to decompose the carbon concentration feedback and carbon climate feedback. So here you can see the first group of bars there, that is the BDRD. So it has everything in. And so if we turn off the carbon climate feedback, you have a second column. If you turn off the carbon concentration feedback, you have the third group of columns, the bars. So you can tell what is the major reason that you see the increase of coupling strengths in the future, which is because of the warming. Okay, and what's the role of nutrient plays here is if you have warming, so the soil warms up and then decompose a lot of accelerate the nutrient mineralization, and so providing more nutrients to support plant growth and all those BDC activity. But if you have only CO2 concentration feedback, which means you don't have warming, but you have increased CO2 and you have response of stomata to the CO2 enrichment. So basically the plant closes up the stomata partially to isolate itself from the atmosphere. So the coupling strengths decline. And the nutrient plays the last important role here. So that's the most important message that these two scatter plots can tell. Another case is for fire and emissions. So this is a fire module that we built it's already exists in the E3SM land model. So you have prognostic simulation of ignition, spread, and duration. Unfortunately, duration is prescribed to 24 hours, which I don't think makes sense, but that is the default configurations. 24 hours of fire burns, we prognostic calculate fire counts and the spread rate. So you can calculate the burn area, and then you can calculate how much carbon, how much vegetation is burned, how much carbon is emitted, how much dry matter is emitted, and then you multiply it by emission factor, you get all kinds of different species. And then you can transport them back into the atmosphere and do all those chemistry calculation, aerosol calculation. And this is an example of ongoing work and analysis. So we are particularly interested in the comparison of Western and Southeast US because we think historically people just pay too much attention to Western US. I don't know, because we live here. But obviously Western is a very major fire region. But the Southeast is also, if you look at the MOLIS fire counts map, there are more fire happening in the Southeast. And maybe I think the reason is just because the fire in the Southeast, a lot of them, they are prescribed fires. So the emission strength and intensity is lower, but it doesn't make sense that we often exclude the Southeast US in the fire now. So this is just a comparison. So in the BGC configuration, we turn on and off. This is very easy in the name list, land name list. You can just do no fire equal to true or false. So that shows you this dash line and solid line in the BGC calculation. And so the difference tells you the fire impacts. And this is just the black carbon mass concentration integrated across the boundary layer. So just I won't provide a deep discussion on here, just show you the difference. So fire do play a very important role, and you see that declining of the BC concentration, mass concentration over the southeast, it's getting cleaner, and same thing over the west, it's also get cleaner in terms of dash line. But because of fire, the west tend to reverse it, and the southeast just continue the difference of solid and dash line. They continue and sustain. And so that's why you see the difference in the AOD, the aerosol optical depth. And more importantly, we wanted to think about impacts of the land surface BGC calculation also. So this is the feedback loop that you have fire, then impacts the near surface condition and feedback to the land surface growth condition for vegetation. So on the bottom right, you see that there is. So the feedback is very complicated, but in the end, you will see the vegetation response because of you have the change of radiation, change of temperature and precipitation. So you have the spatial distribution of GPP either increase or decline at global scale because you have fire. So that's the difference map, percentage change of with and without fire. So I just wanted to showcase, but there are more capability and you can design. So this is the end of my talk, but if you wanted to discuss, I'm happy to continue after this tutorial. I think if you're interested, you can design your own, based on your own science need, design your own BGC experiment and just run it. I think all the configuration are ready. Thank you. Yes.
I didn't quite catch that, but how far are we in the E3SM project from doing fully interactive CO2 driven emission simulation? When are we going to be able to do describe CO2 emission and actually do the fully coupled simulations?
So that is the concept is under test here. So we have all those new land features. BGC turn on, and also the ocean. Nicole also has the ocean and sea ice BGC turn on, and the concept is there, and we're just running at the spin up stage.
So in V3 we'll have CO2 emission driven.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the ILAM plot you showed where E3SM seems to be better than most models for most variables, that was kind of striking to me. You know, any explanation as to why it's doing so well?
Okay. Very good question. Because there's no magic, just tuning. In V1, we spend a lot of time. We do even BGC into comparison. We spend a lot of time, years of time because that's our first version. We wanted to make sure the model is performance is good. So a lot of offline tuning and a lot of test calibration, and we test in different CTC and ECA and do a straight comparison. So that's why we have this well-constrained model as a V1. And then which also build a foundation for V2 and V3 so that we still perform relatively well.
So it's that the CIME models are not constrained, and so this plot's showing that at least it's doing better than.
Yeah, not that much. Yeah, we just spend so much time on this version 1.
Thank you.
Thank you, Qing. Next, we have Karthik Balaguru. Yep, there he is.
All right. Morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Today I'll be presenting an overview of a recent study that we did, where we looked at interactions between two important climate extremes, hurricanes and wildfires, and how that interaction manifests in the Eastern Pacific. And I'd like to also acknowledge my collaborators. Before I begin, just a brief primer on storms in the Eastern Pacific. So if you look at the global tropical cyclone activity, the Eastern Pacific Hurricane Basin is the second most important in the world. It's only next in importance to the Western Pacific because it contributes to nearly 20% of the global tropical cyclone activity. However, despite this, it has received relatively less attention compared to some of the other basins. This is primarily because many of the storms that form here simply form off the coast of Mexico and then spin off towards the Central Pacific, and they don't make landfall because the steering flow is predominantly easterly. So because of their relatively low social impacts, they receive less attention. However, there are some very important storms that form here once in a while, and here are two recent examples in the bottom. So the one on the left is Hurricane Patricia from 2015, and that is to date the strongest tropical cyclone that ever formed in the Western Hemisphere. It reached a maximum intensity of nearly 350 kilometers an hour. And the one on the right was from last year, Hurricane Otis, which set a new record for rapid intensification. So it went from being a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in one day and decimated Acapulco, Mexico. So this is just to say that once in a while, there are some very important storms that form here. And also, if you look at the literature, predominantly most of the studies that looked at these storms were interested in how the El Nino affects their activity. Now, as I mentioned, majority of these storms don't make landfall. That is mainly because of the steering flow. And also another reason is, if you look at the top panel there, that shows the climatological SST. And what you'll see is there is a strong meridional gradient in SST. So if these storms move north, then they hit colder waters very quickly and then tend to weaken. So this is another reason why a lot of storms weaken if they go further north. However, once in a while, the storms do recurve and go towards the southwest US. And this is especially true during the later season months of September and October, when the monsoon trough shifts southward and creates a favorable steering flow. And when they do so, these storms can produce a lot of precipitation over the southwest US. And the bottom left panel is the average precipitation produced by recurving Eastern Pacific hurricanes in the southwest US. And you'll see that for some regions, the contribution is as high as 25% of the entire warm season precipitation. So this is just to set up the problem. So the top left panel shows it's a schematic of the tracks, and the black tracks are the ones that don't make landfall and move towards the Central Pacific, and the yellow ones are the ones that recurve and move toward the southwest US. The red rectangle indicates the region of interest, which is the southwest US. So in the bottom left panel, what you have is various parameters averaged over that southwest US region. So the dotted line is precipitation, and the dashed dotted line is the vapor pressure deficit, and the solid black line is the wildfire burnt area. So what you will see is this region receives most of its precipitation primarily in the winter season, and between the months of May to October is the warm and the dry season. You don't receive much precipitation. And consistent with that, the vapor pressure deficit also increases during that period. So these are dry conditions which are favorable for wildfires, which is reflected in the seasonal cycle of wildfires. Most of the wildfires occur during this period. And in the top right, what you see is a seasonal cycle of Eastern Pacific hurricane activity. So this is represented by this index called ACE, which stands for accumulated cyclone energy. And the solid black line is the ACE for the overall hurricane activity. And the dotted line is only for the recurving hurricanes. And what you'll see is when you look at the overall hurricane activity, it peaks from July to October. And if you specifically focus on the recurring storms, then there is a single sharp peak in September, and then flanked by a little bit in August and October. So the question we ask ourselves is, can these recurring hurricanes play a role in modulating wildfire activity in the Southwest US? So this is the outline for our talk. So first we'll examine whether these Eastern Pacific hurricanes, how they modulate the wildfire environment in the Southwest US. Next, we will see whether we can directly detect the influence of these hurricanes in the wildfire data itself. And finally, we'll look at some long-term projections of hurricane activity and their implications. So let's look at the influence of these storms on the Southwest US, starting with some observations. So what you have on the left is three panels that they are the climatological, the evolution, the composite mean time evolution of precipitation in the top panel. The middle panel is soil moisture, and the bottom panel is vapor pressure deficit. And this is averaged over the Southwest US, and the x-axis represents days. Day zero represents the time of formation of the storm. So what you'll see is, in general, whenever you have Eastern Pacific hurricanes that recur, you have an increase in precipitation, an increase in soil moisture, and a reduction in vapor pressure deficit. And these are three independent data sets, and the timing is very, very consistent. So roughly around day 10 is when you have the peak across all three data sets. This really agree very well. And this set of observations really tell us that indeed, these storms, when they recur, make the environment less conducive for wildfires. So this is based on observations for a period roughly 29 years from 1992 to 2020. The question is, can we substantiate these results with model simulations? So to do this, we look at E3SM NARM, which stands for the North American Regionally Refined Configuration. So in the top two panels, you have the mesh. So the atmospheric grid varies between 25 to 100 kilometers centered over the North American region. And then the ocean and the sea ice grid is to the right, varying between 14 to 60 kilometers. So we use three ensembles of these historical simulations using the RRM configuration. And hurricanes were tracked in RRM using the Tempest Extremes algorithm. This is a scale-aware feature tracking software that operates on the model's native grid. And so the thing I want to point out is in the bottom two panels, what you'll see is the model really well captures the salient features of Eastern Pacific hurricanes. So the top panel is the climatological track density of hurricanes globally from observations from the best track data. And the bottom panel shows the same from the RRM. So what you'll see is in the region of high resolution surrounding the North American region, especially in the Eastern Pacific, the model does a really good job of capturing the tropical cyclone activity. So this is just the track density, but I also want to point out that the model does quite well in getting the other aspects of tropical cyclones, such as the seasonal cycle and so on. And the very interesting thing to see is that the hurricanes in the Eastern Pacific get as strong as nearly Cat 4 strength, which is useful. So again, we do the same type of analysis with the model simulations. So we have the composite mean time evolution of precipitation and vapor pressure deficit. We also looked at soil moisture. And what you'll see is, again, consistent with observations. Whenever you have recurring Eastern Pacific hurricanes, you have an increase in precipitation, a reduction in vapor pressure deficit, and also an increase in soil moisture. And the model agrees really well with observations, both also in terms of the timing. Even here, you'll see that it takes roughly 10 days for the peak to occur in terms of precipitation and the vapor pressure deficit, which is consistent with observations. And also, if you compute the total contribution of recurring Eastern Pacific hurricanes to the precipitation budget of the Southwest US, you'll see that it again agrees really well with observations. So roughly 7% of the entire warm season precipitation can be attributed to these storms. So now that we have convinced ourselves that these storms, when they recur, indeed make the environment less conducive for wildfires, the question then is, can we actually detect this directly in wildfire observations? To do this, we analyzed wildfire data, and we then divided the years into two categories, the years with more wildfires and years with less wildfires. And then we looked at various climate processes such as hurricanes, and then to see whether there's a statistically significant difference between those two. And in addition to hurricanes, we also included the North American monsoon, which plays an important role in driving precipitation in the warm season in the Southwest US. And we also looked at the Santa Ana winds, which are well known to modulate wildfires, especially in the autumn season. So in this table, what is shown is for each of those parameters and for each period during the warm season, the T value and the P value for difference of means between years with less and more wildfires. And the values in bold indicate statistically significant differences, and also negative values indicate a negative influence on wildfires, and positive values indicate a positive influence on wildfires. So when you look at the entire warm season of June to October, what you'll notice is none of these parameters are important. However, when you look at June to September, the North American monsoon becomes important because that is those are the months during which you receive much of the precipitation from the monsoon. However, now when you look at the later season months of September and October, suddenly you'll notice that both the hurricanes and the Santa Ana winds become very important. So years with more hurricanes have less wildfires based on the negative effect. And whenever you have stronger Santa Ana winds, you have more wildfires. And again, you can divide the September and October into the 2 months. And when you separate them, what you'll see is the hurricanes become more important during the month of September, and the Santa Ana winds become more important during the month of October. And this agrees really well. If you remember from the earlier slide, we saw that the recurring hurricanes peak during the month of September. So this agrees really well with the climatology. And we get additional evidence when we look at the large-scale environment. So on the left, the two figures show the deep layer steering flow, which is based on the weighted mean of winds in the upper and lower troposphere. And on the right, the shading indicates the sea level pressure, and the vectors are the 850 millibar winds. And the top row shows the difference between recurving and no recurving years, and the bottom shows the difference between less and more wildfire burned area years. So when you look at the steering flow, if you focus on that, what you'll see is the top panel shows that during years with more recurring storms, the steering flow is more westerly, which makes sense because a westerly steering flow would not allow the storms to go towards the west, and instead it will push the storms closer to the coast. And also you see there is a cyclonic circulation just to the west of Baja California, which again plays a role in steering the storms towards the Southwest US. And now if you look at the bottom left panel, which is the steering flow difference between years with less and more burnt area, you will see that it is broadly consistent with what you see at the top, that is with the years with more recurring storms. And similar is the case when you look on the right, in terms of differences in sea level pressure and lower level circulation. So this shows that the large scale environment is indeed consistent with the idea that during years with recurring storms, there would be less wildfires. So finally, let's look at long-term changes. So the top panel here shows the trends in the track density for Eastern Pacific hurricanes. This is based on, again, the 3-member ensemble mean. And the bottom shows long-term trends in the delivery of precipitation from recurving Eastern Pacific hurricanes to the Southwest US. So what you'll notice is that there are negative trends in the track density that shows that there is a long-term decline in Eastern Pacific hurricanes. And this is consistent when you look at the precipitation delivery to the Southwest US, where there is a statistically significant decreasing trend. And what this suggests is over the historical period from 1850 to 2014, there's been a decline in the recurving Eastern Pacific hurricanes and their ability to deliver moisture to the Southwest US. And this has very likely enhanced the aridity of this region and also made that region more conducive for wildfires. And this is also consistent with some recent studies which have projected Eastern Pacific hurricane activity into the future. And what they have shown is that there is a continued decline likely into the future. And these results have a lot of implications, not just regarding wildfires, but even beyond them in terms of the overall hydroclimate of the Southwest US. So here's a summary, and I just want to mention one thing. These RRM simulations have been really amazing because they are, so you have the high resolution over the North American region, which allows you to look at these extreme climate events associated with this region. And also because of the globally lower resolution outside, these simulations are computationally not that expensive. So this is a great tool to look at various climate processes associated with the North American region, especially for the Western United States. And here's the reference. Thanks.
Was that the simulation is fully coupled or?
Yes, fully covered.
How is the model performance during the mesh transition regions?
Sorry?
How is the model performance during the mesh transition regions? You transition from low resolution to high resolution, so how do hurricane perform in those transitions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll go here. So here's the interesting thing, right? So you see, when you look at the mesh, right? So this, to a large extent, explains why you should only have a stronger Eastern Pacific hurricane activity, but not such a strong activity in the Atlantic, because the mesh covers the main development region for the storms in the Eastern Pacific, but not so much so in the Atlantic sector. Because if you see, this is the main development region off the coast of Africa all the way up to the Caribbean, right? So if you look at the mesh, it doesn't cover that region. However, in the Eastern Pacific, the mesh really starts here. And then this is where most of the storms form. So that is why you're able to capture the activity on the Pacific side better.
Have you looked at any individual storm and how the structure is evolved when it transitions from coarse to high resolution mesh?
So luckily, for the Eastern Pacific basin, I mean, the storms predominantly were within the high resolution region. So we didn't have to look at transition ones. But if you were to be, let's say, if you were interested in storms that affected Hawaii or maybe that traveled towards the Central Pacific towards a dateline, then potentially something like that could be, looked at.
I have more of a science question, but so both tropical cyclone activity and wildfire formation in the Southwest US, I guess, would be related to low tropospheric moisture. So is there a way to control for low tropospheric moisture? That could be simply the cause for both things happening without there being a causal link between them.
You mean the reason for decline?
What I'm thinking is if you have a very moist lower troposphere, you can form a lot of hurricanes and you would also prevent wildfires from occurring a little bit without it meaning that the hurricanes are themselves being the possibility of lower.
Yeah, so no, that's a good point. The thing is, in in a way, it is true, I would say, for the wildfires more. But see, with the hurricane, it's not enough to have a moist, lower troposphere.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you would simulate storms, but then whether they would travel towards the southwest US also depends on the dynamics, not just the thermodynamics, because you need the favorable steering flow. So you can't just enhance the lower tropospheric moisture and expect the storms to travel.
Thanks, Karthik. So I wonder, is there a way to look at longer term interactions? Because if you have weather condition, you certainly suppress wildfire, but what happened to the surface fuel condition? You have a chance to build more. That's right.
Yeah, so we were looking at coincident kind of effects. So hurricanes that occur during the warm season, and then their ability to modulate the environment during that period. So not like a huge time separation between the two. However, what you are talking about is the hurricanes fueling vegetation growth, and then their effect in the following seasons, wildfires or something like that. I think that's an interesting point. Maybe that is something to look at.
For this figure, I was wondering which observation did you use and at what spatial and temporal.
Yeah, this is the IB tracks data. And so if you're familiar with it, so they just compile their data sets from different agencies across the world, like the National Hurricane Center and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center.
Thank you, Qing, and thank you, Karthik. Next up, we'll have Rob Jacob talking about testing the code, and I believe there's a practicum part, or?
It's optional.
It's optional. But if you wanted to, you can open up your SSH terminal.
I was also asked to talk about code review. And not just the basics of code review on our GitHub, but kind of this code review process that we set up for bringing in, if you have a lot of you may go home from this and back to your institutions, and you may be developing some new feature for the model. And you may want that feature to eventually make its way into the actual model code instead of just living on your branch. Now we have some development processes about working with Git for doing that, but there's a larger process for engaging with the group, engaging with the core E3SM project to make sure that your feature can actually get into the model as a permanent part of the source code. So that is on. So on the agenda, I put a link to our public Confluence page about our code review process. And I'm just going to go over that a little bit. You see that okay, or should I blow it up? Let's try blowing it up. All right. So first, a little bit on some of the terminology about a feature change to the model, and you may have already seen some of these terms and know what they mean. A bit for bit change is the easiest one to make. That means you've altered the source code in some way, but you haven't changed the answers in any of the comp sets that we test or that we use. They remain identical. And another possible class of changes is round off. Like you've changed maybe an algorithm a little bit, so that, or maybe you just change the order of operations on some algebraic equation. And that, because of floating point, that will make a round off change to the model. Over time, it would grow to a different climate if you compare it to a companion run. But it doesn't. It's not really statistically significantly changing the climate. It's just a round off. Those require a little bit more examination. And then finally, a climate changing simulation would obviously require a lot of work to validate and get it accepted by the model. Maybe you swapped out one parameterization for another, or you have an entirely different model of some part of the system. Or you tune something in such a way, yeah.
So bit for bit, does that depend on the system that you
Yeah, we only mean bit for bit within a given machine compiler
How do you
combination.
capture all the differences between like 4 different configurations, format, et cetera, whatever?
Well, we have baselines, and I'll talk about this in the testing,
Which one?
for each of the configurations. And then we can compare, you can do a bit for bit comparison with those. Yeah. And then a stealth feature doesn't mean it's hidden necessarily. It just means that it's turned off. You've done a lot of code development, you've added a new parameterization, but you got a little switch that keeps it off from the model unless you set this value to true. And we refer to those as stealth features. It's not pejorative. It's just a way of noting that there's a lot happening here if you possibly turn that little flag on. And what we want you to do is we want you to actually test the model with the feature on, even though you're proposing to put it in with the feature off, because we don't want to find out later down the road what happens when the feature gets turned on. We want to know when it's accepted into the code. So we haven't set this up yet, but we are going to make available what we call reference solutions. For example, right now we are running version 3 simulations with various configurations, and portions of those will be available as references for you to compare against as you're developing your feature. And periodically we will update those reference simulations as the code evolves. They're fixed on various maintenance branches. We don't really need to update them. But for the main branch, the master branch, which is changing periodically, we will need to update these, and they will allow you to compare your change against an official good set of simulation results. So one of the first things that, and this, I'm mostly going to focus on the externally funded work here. So what's really important about the code review process, and we keep calling it the code review process, but it's more than just the actual code review, the first part of this process is to let us know what's happening before you start writing code. Because you don't want to write a bunch of code and find out months later that we're not interested, or this can't possibly work within our plans. So before writing code, we'd like you to write what we call a new feature overview document. And it's basically a high-level description. It doesn't have to be, it's not a paper, or you can reference a paper, but it's just a few sentences or a paragraph about what you're trying to do here. And what parts of the code are you going to modify? What are you going to add to the source code? What kind of infrastructure changes do you maybe have to make? And then also tell us, well, how do you expect this to make the code better? And that can, again, just be a few words. And then describe what kind of changes you might need to the documentation. That's usually pretty obvious. You're going to add some documentation to your new feature. You might have to adjust some existing documentation to talk about how it works. What kind of impacts do you expect on performance? There might be none. There might be down the noise. You might be expecting it to get faster with your changes. Maybe you expect it to slow down a little, but it's worth it because of the climate improvements. And then if relevant, you can talk about any papers you're going to write based on this work. And then, and like I said, this whole code review process is still in development, so I don't have a template to point you to write this yet, but watch this page, because when we do, we will link to it from here. And then some staff will start reviewing this proposed feature change. And remember, ideally this is before any code gets written, so that you're not possibly wasting your time. And depending on what component this feature is targeting, it might be targeting more than one. Component leads will get together, huddle together, and figure out, does this work for where we see the model going? And there may be some back and forth communication with the proposer of the feature. And the performance and infrastructure group might get involved to kind of assess, is this really going to have the performance improvements that they think it will, or performance effects that they think it will. And we will create some compliments pages on this site to document things. And so after it's approved, and we'll assume it is approved, you can start your development on a fork. And we have a link to our development getting started guide, which goes over how we like to have branches made, how we like to have them named, the commit process, commit messages, things like the basics of using Git to do development in E3SM. And a handy tip, if the feature you're contemplating is very large, a lot of code changes, talk with us about how you might split that up into several pull requests. So you're not making one giant pull request for the new feature for the model all at once. And when the work is completed, you might need to revise the overview document because you probably made some changes along the way that you weren't anticipating. That's fine. And there's then some, once the PR is ready, there's some testing that needs to be done. Of course, we have our own internal testing that will be performed no matter what. But if it's bit for bit, there's not a lot more you have to do. The PR is up, it'll go through the normal pull request review process. If it's a round off level change, we want you to do a bit more. You can provide some evidence that it really is just round off. You can point to the code. Look, I only changed the order of operation in these lines. That's obviously round off and fine. Maybe you have some analytical solutions that you can show or you can show the error growth, something like that. We do have a non-bit for bit test suite that actually does some statistical comparisons of a code run with your change against some statistics of a known solution. And it can tell you if you can test a null hypothesis that this climate is the same as this climate. And if you fail them, if you pass them, great. If you fail them, maybe you can take a closer look because it's maybe not a round off level change. Finally, a stealth feature, which we're assuming here is one that is making more than a round off change because maybe you've added an entirely new parameterization or you've replaced one parameterization with another. We want to ensure that that's covered by a timer. You want to demonstrate that you can tell that the feature is on or off. Maybe there's a log message in the log file. We have a super bit for bit test suite. I'll talk about that more in a minute. You can document performance. We also have an HPC test suite, which will really stress the performance of the system and help us determine if the new feature is performing as it is, affecting like the years per day as expected. And then we ask you to perform a few years simulation of the component that your feature is addressing, and we can compare that against one of these reference solutions. Also, even if you're only targeting one component, like you're only working on the land model or you're only working on the atmosphere model, we still want you to do a fully coupled case with your new feature because we want to know that it's not going to have side effects when run in a fully coupled configuration. That's going to be especially important if we want to include it in all of our configurations going forward. And then if you know it's a climate changing feature, then basically we want those runs to be longer. And longer is still kind of up for debate. We're thinking at least 10 years. It may be longer if the 10-year changes are substantial. And then the pull request review process. It'll only go, those always get scrutinized by what we call our integrators. They'll get a bit more scrutiny if they're coming from outside the project. And again, it's important not to bundle multiple features into a single PR. There's various approvals that will have to happen on the PR. The simulation group lead that the PR is affecting, the component lead will all have to approve it. We're going to ask for some additional testing to be done, especially on stealth features. And finally, when all that's done, hopefully the feature is accepted into the model. It'll be part of our regular test suite, so it won't go stale or break. And other people can start developing off of it. You can do more developments off of it, and the model can continue to progress. Okay. Any questions about the so-called code review process? Yeah.
You give an example of like a stealth feature. I guess is there any feature that just wouldn't be used in the CIME?
No, it's any feature that is off by default in our standard like fully coupled CIME cases. Yeah. And then yeah, off by default, yes.
Given the
breadth of testing from, small scale bit for bit to, at least a couple years, a couple simulation? Like, what's the ballpark node hours that, testing would require? Mesh and.
Yeah, I mean, expensive testing comes when you do the fully coupled simulations, but we're only asking for like a decade or so, and that's pretty cheap at our standard 100-kilometer resolution. Yeah. And we're assuming that if you're developing for E3SM, you may have an account here at NERSC, so you probably got the hours to do it. Yeah.
You talk about some of the components that maybe don't canonically live in E3SM, so I'm thinking CIME, Mozart.
That don't what?
They don't like live in E3SM necessarily, they're external.
Oh, yeah, so components that are brought in by a submodule do typically have their own requirements. And since you're coming in through the submodule, you first have to get into the main code base. And so you would need to follow whatever they have established. And then usually if it's a submodule that's already included within E3SM, this is actually a good question. I'm not sure if it's going to require any additional review. Usually we're pretty in tune with what's happening with the submodules. Yeah.
They were testing some new feature, but like, of course, we don't want to just keep uploading everything we test, right? So like, what's the threshold, or at what point do we decide, hey, this cool new thing I'm working on, like, should go into the model? We talk with the project team, or what's?
Yeah, you'll be talking with the project team. Either probably somebody from the group, from the model group that your feature's targeting will be talking to you, and they'll be able to tell you, okay, this is ready. Yeah.
How do you deal with the complexity of, say, forcing or initialization? So I'm just thinking in a situation where, for example, you've got an observational typology that you initialize the ocean state from, and that's wrong, and you want to change it.
Yeah.
How are you going to do that? And then, I mean, beyond that, that would be pre-industrial control simulation where you're initializing from a different state. Then historical forcing changes, which are likely to happen relatively regularly. You're going to get a different climate because you've got a different forcing agent, which may not be related to with code changes actually.
Yeah.
So how does all that kind of that complicates things a lot?
It does. So this is mostly talking about changes to the base source code, and so the source code does have within it the pointers to the specific input and historical files that we're using. So if you're just saying, I just want to change those, I'm not changing the code. Well, that's still a pull request. It's still a code change.
Well, the only issue would be if you change it forcing, then the model response is going to change, which effectively means sensitivity of the aerosol scheme or something. Like all of these things it's a complicated chain.
It is, but if you're doing that in your own experiments, that's fine. But what this process is about is if you want the E3SM model to change its default to use these new forcings, then you would still go through this. Yeah.
How often are proposed new features not approved?
It's almost never happened because no one's actually officially gone through this yet. Yeah. Well, what's happening is a lot of the bigger projects in DOE that are using E3SM have a fork, and they're keeping stuff on their fork, and not really pushing it back yet.
Was that a 100% approval or a 0?
Yeah, not defiant. Yes. All right. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is our test system, and which is used within that code review process, but also something you may want to use. I encourage you to use in the course of your own development of the model. Even if you're not planning to ever ask for something to be officially contributed. So what I'm mostly going to talk about here is another one of the scripts that's in the main script directory for the case control system. On Tuesday, I talked to you about create new case. The other major script in that same directory is create test. So create test is a very powerful system within the case control system for running tests of the full model and the or of the full executable. And it's a pretty simple to invoke. It's create test and then the test name. And everything that the test does is controlled by parsing this test name, which has very specific features in it, which I'm going to go over. So the test name starts out with a test type, which is a 3 or 4 letter string, saying what the test is going to do. There's some possible modifiers to that. There's a grid and a comp set alias, which are things you're familiar with by now. The machine and compiler, usually the machine is whatever machine you're running on, so you don't have to give that. The compiler will be the default compiler usually, but you can't specify another one if it's supported. And then there's some possible test mods, which I'll talk about. So here's an example. I'm going to run the ERP test on a case that has this low resolution test grid configuration that we use. And it's an F case with the constant 2010 forcing case. So the test type is this first part is the general type of the test. And you know about a grid and a comp set. Like I said, like it's shown here, the machine and compiler are optional parts of the test name. If you don't provide them, it will just figure out what machine you're on, like Perlmutter, and use the default compiler. So I'm going to, let's see. What do I want to do here? Share my screen here. Blow this up a little bit. E3SM CIME scripts. Create new case. Oops, create test. All right. So what's going to happen with create test is it's going to automatically do all of the steps that are required to create, set up, build, and submit a case. And then it might run actually 2 cases. And then it'll actually compare what the output of those 2 runs are to determine if the test is pass or fail. So every test ends in a pass fail. So as you can see, it's going through the steps to create, build, and run the case. I'm going to let that go while I talk some more about the actual test system.
Well, we're missing that line right above, like where you said, for example,
What?
like on the CIME, this page,
Mhm.
where it says, for example, and then we don't have that. I keep referring to.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is a preview of some changes I made.
Okay, but
This will be live later. Yeah.
Okay, I'm like, it's not-
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So what kind of test types are there? There's a lot, and we don't actually use all of them, but I'm going to explain some of them to you. So that there's the ERS test is an exact. First of all, these tests are testing functionality. We expect the model to be able to have certain properties that are functional properties of the system, not scientific properties. We don't have, and none of these tests will tell you, oh, the atmosphere is bad, or the atmosphere is not conserving energy. We're working on those, or this climate's no good. We don't have automatic pass-fail tests for that, and that's not a software issue. That's kind of a field issue. You know, we don't as a field have a set of metrics you can calculate and say this climate is pass-fail. But we do want the model to be able to do certain things to make development and running of the simulation possible. And one of these is what's called exact restart. So restart is a concept you've probably already been familiar with. Basically, if you're doing a long run, you can do a long run of 20 years, let's say, in a submission that takes 24 hours. But maybe that you're not allowed to run for 24 hours. So you have to do it in 2 10-year chunks. Well, those 2 10-year chunks should give you exactly bit for bit identical answers as if you actually ran the thing for 20 full years. So we call this exact restart. It's also referred to as being able to checkpoint a model. And there's actually research done in computer science about how to automatically checkpoint and execute an application just using knowledge of the system. And that's very interesting, but we don't need any of that because a climate has in general had the ability to do checkpoint or restart for as long as it's been around, because we have this need of doing our simulations that last much longer than the typical queue length. So climate models have always been able to exactly restart, and it's a property we never want to break. And so this exact restart test will test that. And like you can see up here, you can match that string exact restart with any comp set and grid that you want. So you might have the comp set that exercises your feature, and you can combine it with this grid and test type to test exact restart. By default, it'll do an 11-day run. It'll drop a restart file at day 6. It'll then do a second run, picking up that file, running for 5 days, so it's getting to exactly the same endpoint. Each run is output history files. They're always from the coupler, which are normally files you never look at, but the test system knows how to control coupler output. So, and the coupler is outputting all the fields. The coupler history outputs all the fields that pass through the coupler. So it's fields coming from every model. And then a utility called CPRNC, compare net CDF, because these are net CDF files, will do a bit for bit comparison of every point of every field of the 2 coupler history files. So it's hundreds of values, thousands of values that's comparing. And if any of them, and it's calculating, I think, some global statistics. And it's doing floating point comparison, so there's a little margin of error in there, but if it's within that margin, the 2 files are called identical, and the test passes. If anything is different, if even 1 point is different in 1 field, the floating point comparison will fail and the test will fail. So it's a very sensitive test. And if anything is breaking in the restartability, it's going to catch it. The test that I'm running, I shall get to that in a minute. We also demand that the model give identical answers when you change the number of MPI tasks. So if you run it on 100 nodes, or you run the same case on 200 nodes, it's going to give you exactly the same answers. And we can do that because we've been very careful about how global sums happen. We actually do quad precision and convert things to integers. And so the answer, so if any of the numerical methods depend on doing a global sum, it's still going to normally that would result in differences if you change the task count. But for our models, they do not. So you're going to get identical answers on different numbers of processors. And so the PEM test, processor counts for MPI tasks, by default does a 5-day run. It'll start the run with the default number of tasks, and then it'll drop them in half. So it'll reconfigure the model to run on half the number of MPI tasks that it normally uses, does 2 5-day runs, compares the coupler output, makes sure they're bit for bit identical. The PEM test does the same thing for threads. We also demand that the model give identical answers if you change the number of threads. These are the heavyweight threads, not the GPU threads, although we can also do that. So the PEM test will change the threads, will drop the threads in half and do 2 runs, compare the output. That ERP test that I talked about, that I'm running right now, is kind of a combination of all of those. So what it'll do is it'll do a first run. So it's a restart test. So it's going to do 1 run with the default number of threads and tasks. And then it's going to do a restart file gets dropped while it does that. It's then going to drop the threads and tasks in half, pick up that restart file, do a shorter run, and compare the output. And those also have to be identical. And if it does, then the ERP test will do this. So it's kind of doing 3 tests in 1. Yeah.
And testing the change in the number of tasks and threads at the same time is bit for bit with testing them individually.
Some of the other tests that we use frequently, this is a great one, the smoke test. Does it run? In this case, it's not doing a comparison of history output, because there's only one set of history output. It's just looking for a run successful message at the end of the log file. And if it's there, then you pass the smoke test, the thing runs. And if it's not there, it's considered to fit. Rest of my ones here. The REP test simply does 2 identical runs. So it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the task count. It doesn't change the threads. It just does 2 identical runs. And what that's looking for is have you snuck in any kind of randomness into your initialization procedure. And this did actually catch something once in the ocean. I can't quite remember the details. So there's more test types here with explanations of them and how long they run. But each one of those tests can be modified to do something a little bit different. For example, most of the tests will compile the code with the production level compiler settings, so optimization. But maybe you want to run a test with debugging on it. You can do that by simply adding a -d to the test type, like I did here. So that will run exactly the same test, all the same parameters, but now debugging flags are turned on when it compiles, which might catch additional problems. And then maybe the 11 days is a bit too long, so you want to change that, or maybe you want to lengthen it. The -L modifier, along with a letter, can change how long the test runs for. So in this case, I'm going to change it to run for 3 days instead of 11 days. That's still enough to do an exact restart test for most cases. And you can combine these. You can start chaining these together to do multiple modifiers. Let's see how my test is doing. Still building. Not too, is it still? Yeah, it's still building. So as you can see, the test name is confined to comp sets and grid sets that are defined in the system. But you might want to run a test that's just a slight modification to those comp sets. Like maybe you want to change a nameless parameter. Normally you'd have to introduce a whole new comp set that happens to have that nameless parameter changed. Except there's another feature in the test system that allows you to slightly modify the comp set through what's called a test case modifier. And then what that looks like is here. Now to use these, you have to use the full test name. So I still have my basic test here, and I've added the machine and the compiler. And then this last bit of the string here, that's the test modifier. And what create test does, so everything create test is doing is parsing this really long string. So what create test will do when it encounters that string is it'll look at a directory in the EAM source code file, EAM source code directory. For E3SM, this is the path. So there's EAM, scene config, test definitions, test mod ders, and finally EAM. And then after the dash here, there's another directory which I called RRTMGP. And in RRTMGP, there is a shell commands file, which has the XML change command to use a different radiation scheme than the default. And so my test, my ERP test for the F2010 case at this test resolution will be run with this alternate radiation scheme, which is still in the model as a stealth feature. And those commands get applied. And because shell commands is executing shell commands, you can do a lot to alter the test. I've seen people edit source code with these and call Python with these and other things. So the contents of a test mods directory, this RRTMGP directory, can have in it. It can have user name list files, and those will just be copied into the case directory of the test and used. It can have shell commands like I just showed you. It can have the names of additional test mods that will get added on to the test mod you're pointing to. And the path is a little long for these. I actually think it's too long. But because you're testing an F case, it'll look in EAM scene config for the test mod. And because I'm going to alter something in the atmosphere, I have another case of EAM in this path. If I was going to maybe alter something in the land model for an F case, I might put that under an Elm subdirectory in this EAM directory. So the path naming is a bit convoluted, but these test mods do allow you to test even more things about the system without going through the hassle of making a new comp set. All right, so let's see how this test is doing. Still building. Wow. All right. I'm going to put this in the background. So it's recording what it does as it does it. It created the case, it ran setup, it's running build. When it's done running build, it'll submit, and then this part will exit, and I'll get my prompt back. And I can shift attention to where the test directory is. The test directory is just a case directory, just like create new place grades, but there's a bit more stuff in it. So I'm going to go find that. I'm going to put this in the background. And I'm going to go to pscratch. And the E3SM scratch. Nope. Oops, you. So create test will make a case dir for the test, and it'll put it in what's called the scene root. It's basically pscratch on Perlmutter. It's pscratch plus these other two subdirectories, and it created a case with the name of my test, and it added a string to it to basically distinguish this run of the test from another run of the test. So you might, as you're modifying code, you might run this test multiple times. This directory will fill up with runs of your test. In order for them to not write over each other, it creates a string to help distinguish them. And it's basically year, month, day, hour, minute, second, and then a random hash. And if you want to, you can replace all this with a string that makes sense to you. With a oh, it finished. Okay. An error. An error in the build, really? Okay, I don't know what's happening there, but this is good because we can look more at what the test does. So it creates this extra long directory name to distinguish multiple runs of the test for each other. You can just look at the last. Oh, another thing that it does is it creates this file. It creates this program called CS status. And what CS status will do is you can just run this and it'll output the phases of the test and how they're doing. And this is very useful if you run more than one test, which I'm going to get into in a minute. If you're just running one test, you can just look in the directory. So in the directory, it looks like a case dir, and because it is a case directory, it's got some extra stuff in it though, because it's running a test. It has a test status.log file, which is everything, all the output of all the other scene commands that test made. You know, create test is calling under the hood, case setup and case build and case submit, and the output from all those will appear in this test status.log file. And then it has a summary file, test status, which is just the pass fail status of each phase as it goes through the process of building and running the log. As you can see, I failed build. So this test is a fail. If you fail to build, the test fails, and then it never runs. So the overall status of this is a fail. So the basic steps of a test will all be pass fail. But then once the test runs, there's other phases that it will report on. And a lot of these don't make any sense unless I have a baseline. So let me go check about baselines. But basically, each phase can be in 3 states: pass, fail, or penned. Penned is typically the submit state, because if it's stuck in, if it's in the queue waiting to run, it'll say penned. All right. So there's some examples on this page. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Let me, so create test has a help, create test -- help. You can look at all the options that it has. There are 2 ways of controlling multiple test runs. One uses XML files, the other uses a Python dictionary. E3SM uses the Python dictionary. So I'm going to talk about that. We have, using the Python dictionary, we have defined test suites. So a test suite is, as you might expect, it's just a list of tests. You have a test type, a case, a test type, a comp set, a grid, maybe some test modifiers, all grouped together into one suite. So if I typed in create test E3SM developer, it would run all of those tests. And there's about 60 of them in the E3SM developer suite. It would run them using the source code that if I invoke create tests from the CIME directory inside the source code, it'll run the test on that source code, including whatever modifications you made to it. You can use E3SM developer, and then you can use, you can like, I want to run E3SM developer, except I want to exclude that test because I'll know that test. So you can do things like this with the command line. There's a command called list E3SM tests. I'm going to show you where that is. It's in the CIME directory. In capital CIME tools. So first of all, if I invoke the help, I will get a list of all the test suites we've defined. There's test suites for individual components. Like E3SM Mozart developer has a list of tests for the Mozart model that the developers would like you to run. So obviously, if you're developing Mozart code, you will be running create test E3SM Mozart developer a lot. And there's one for the land, for the atmosphere. And these are a list of test strings let's take a look at what this T test. What's in E3SM developer? And here's the list of all the tests that it runs. It's helpfully filled out the machine and compiler, but that info actually isn't in the test list so that you can run the test on any machine. But here's a bunch of tests in E3SM developer. I have some ERS tests. I have some SMS tests. I'm testing F cases. I'm testing LM cases. Testing a little bit of everything because this is the E3SM developer suite. So it's got a little bit of everything in it. And when you're about ready to push a pull request, or maybe even before that, you should definitely run E3SM developer. What comp sets does E3SM developer test? Well, it tests all these comp sets. So some I cases, a C case, a couple of D cases, some F cases. There's possibly multiple tests run with these. These are the unique comp sets that it tests. What grids are in E3SM developer? All these grid aliases are tested by E3SM developer. So this program, which again is kind of hiding in the CIME tools directory, will let you query that Python dictionary. Where's the Python dictionary actually at? It's in seed and config in the top level, and it's just called test.py. And it uses inheritance. So for example, E3SM Mozart developer will inherit all of the tests in E3SM Mozart sediment, and it will also run all of these tests. And you can inherit multiple things. E3SM developer inherits all of these test suites and runs all of these. This time is, I believe, if I remember right, it's the default time per test. I can't remember. Just because it needs something to start out with. All right, really quick, in the minute I've left, I want to talk about baselines. So remember how I said these tests are outputting coupler history because the create test framework and CIME knows how to use XML change commands to tell the model to output coupler history. So every time you run the test suite, you're going to have a whole bunch of coupler history files. And if you save those coupler history files someplace, that becomes what we call a baseline. So now the next time you run the test, maybe you change something that changed the answers. Remember, these are functional tests. You still restart correctly, you still pass the smoke test. Those all pass, but you change the answers. How do you know that you changed the answers? You compare it against the baseline. So if you tell the test suite to compare against baselines, which I do with this -C command, it basically adds to the testing. So it will do all the tests that a smoke test does, or an ERS test does. And then it'll also compare the coupler history output with what you stored in your baseline. And that will tell you if you just changed the answers or not. Basically, are the artifacts of this test exactly identical to the artifacts of the test when I ran it previously? So that's how you guard against accidentally changing answers during your development. Because that can happen in a complicated code. E3SM. And all of our baselines on our supported machines are kept in one place. So you have like some official baselines for the latest version of master that you can compare against. You can make your own baselines too in your own directory. All right. Any questions about the test system? Yeah.
In the you just how you said running in test, it will build and one the case just will submit. And what's the status or what type of the status for a test debug or whether?
Oh, it will try to run them. It'll run them on the default number of nodes, which will typically drop you in the regular queue. Yeah.
So will we need to wait for the in the queue?
Yes. Yeah, the test wait in the queue. Now there's a modifier that will lower the processor count. So you can add that modifier to get you on low enough nodes to put you in the, and you can also actually specify the queue. I think that's also an option. Yeah.
Is it possible to add a new test?
Yeah.
A new concept or new feature developed? How is that easy?
Yeah, that test.py file that I showed you, that's in the source code. You just make a PR to edit that.
Modify that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. I think we have a break now.
Yeah. All right, so we'll continue our next set of talks. Starting us off is Darin Comeau talking about polar processes, sea level rise, and coastal impacts.
Thanks. So I'll be talking about the third of E3SM's in science drivers and science campaign, which is polar focus, polar processes, sea level rise, and coastal impacts. So I wanted to start off with what are some of our driving science questions and goals for this phase of the project. And a lot of this has to do with uncertainties in modeling mass loss from Greenland and Arctic ice sheets, and how those contribute to projections of sea level rise, and how that uncertainty in modeling is partitioned between climate processes and ice sheet processes, and how polar climate biases can impact, or how polar biases can impact global climate biases via teleconnections. So our goal is to address these questions, really advancing the modeling of mass loss from Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, and addressing the role of polar biases in global biases and vice versa. Now, the name, I'll go back to the name of our group because it's got a lot of words in it. I'll be talking a lot about polar processes, a little bit about sea level rise, and not at all about coastal impacts, to set some expectations. So E3SM is in a very small group of global couple models that have ice shelf cavities in the ocean domain. That allows us to calculate melt rates from Antarctic ice sheets that allow us to quantify in some portion of sea level rise due to Antarctic mass loss. Now, these configurations, the geometry of the ice sheet is static. So the ice sheet itself is not coupled to the model in these simulations and does not evolve, but we can still calculate the melt contribution from ice shelf basal melting. At this time when, so the figure on the right is from our V1 simulation campaign. And at that time, we were one of only 2 models that had this capability. I think we actually had it in first. We just didn't get published first. I know of at least one other model now, from Alfred Wagner Institute, that uses the FESOM model that's about to have a paper coming out publishing similar results. So the field is getting crowded, but we were one of the first. So some of the questions that we can address here is trying to simulate these ice shelf melt fluxes in a low-res global coupled model. That's what we did for V1. We can also use this to understand some specific polar processes. So how the ice shelf melt fluxes influence, say, sea ice formation through a water transformation analysis that was done by one of our postdocs a couple of years ago. And on the right, so there can be tipping points in these systems where certain processes can be activated that lead to runaway melt under some of these big ice shelves that can have huge impacts on global sea level rise. And so we can use the model to sort of better understand those. So for V2, we decided to move to a Southern Ocean regionally refined configuration to better put resolution in the ocean ice around our region of interest. The atmosphere in these simulations is still the NE30 100-kilometer atmosphere. But in this configuration, we go down to 12-kilometer resolution around the Antarctic, gets us close to Eddy permitting, not quite Eddy resolving. So we still need some submesoscale Eddy parameterization on. And in these configurations, we do calculate ice shelf basal melt fluxes from Antarctica, but in order to not double count the contribution for Antarctic ice sheet runoff, we need to disable the what's referred to as snow capping, which is effectively precipitation that falls over Antarctica above some certain height is immediately just routed to the coast as runoff in the standard model. So to avoid double counting, we have removed that. This does impose a bit of a violation of conservation of mass in the system. And so in this, to give you context of what that is, in this 1,000-year control run we did with repeat 1950 conditions, that amounted to about 40 centimeters of sea level rise. So we did a 1,000-year control run and then 3 ensemble members, historical through SSP. To give an indication of why we were looking at higher resolution around Antarctica, this is just zooming in on some of the larger ice shelves around Antarctica and showing the grid resolution for standard resolution and the storm configuration. So we end up getting, in our region of interest, about 9 times as many grid cells over low resolution for an increase of cost of a little over a factor of 2. And on the top right here, showing what this, what the domain actually looks like in the model when I say that the ocean domain has been extended under ice shelf cavities. We saw a big bias reduction in the key properties in the Southern Ocean that are of interest to us and that are really driving the melt rates that are sort of a big focus of interest for us. So it's really the seafloor temperature mostly, but also salinity around the Antarctic continental shelf that is the biggest driver of Antarctic melt rates. So if the continental shelf gets too warm, that gets us dangerously close to and possibly passing a tipping point where we'll see runaway melting or really transition to high melt regimes under these big ice shelves that produce melt rates that are just not at all in line with present day observations. And so to look at a few different time series of what these ice shelf basal melt rates look like in the Southern Ocean regionally refined configuration and low resolution. So I'll start with the figure on the bottom right. The Amory ice shelf is one of the ones that we have trouble with where the model is consistently warm there. In the low resolution configuration, you can see these huge swings, orders of magnitude beyond what's the present day observations, the tiny blue and orange bars at the bottom for scale. And yeah, the Abbott ice shelf in the Bellingshausen Sea sector. This is a sector that we're also very interested in because this is a warm shelf region, and some of the glaciers here are really key to their buttressing effect of holding back the West Antarctic ice sheet, concentrated on a few glaciers that are highly sensitive to ocean conditions. And one last slide of why low resolution was not working for us, and we needed to move to this Southern Ocean Regional Refined Mesh. So we had a number of very key metrics that we needed to be comfortable with, or to declare, in order to declare success in being confident in the ice shelf based melt rates that we were simulating to be somewhat realistic. And we just could not get that in low resolution. We did a number of various tuning efforts to try to get the Southern Ocean to look better in both low resolution and this storm configuration. And it was always a bit of a whack-a-mole trade-off where we could get the Southern Ocean to look good, but had to accept some global biases that were worse or more severe than in the standard resolution, or rather in the standard configuration. So now to talk up some successes. So we just finished this simulation campaign earlier this year. So on the right, I'm showing the time series of the ice shelf basal melt fluxes over the 1,000-year 1950 control conditions. And I should say we use 1950 control rather than the standard 1850 control, because for simulating ice shelf basal melt rates, we really don't care about the time period between 1850 and 1950, where we really wanted to get out to future projections as soon as possible. And really the 1950 conditions are, while still not representative of the present day observations that we have today, closer than 1850. So you can see the branch points where we branched off the 3 historical ensemble members, and then as they continue through the SSP 370 scenario, you can really see a marked increase in the total ice shelf basal melt rates through year 2100 under the scenario. And here's showing the Antarctic sea ice volume through these scenarios, which again, it's showing across the SSPs a pretty marked decline in Antarctic sea ice area that's in part interplaying with this general ocean warming and increase of ice shelf basal melting. So let's see if there's any of the other points that I wanted to mention. I guess, yeah, under the bad, not to highlight too much of the negative here, is one of the trade-offs that we had to sort of accept when in getting a better Southern Ocean climate in terms of tuning some of the knobs that are in the ocean model, which in our case was the GM and ready submesoscale eddy parameterizations, was that those ended up outside of the Southern Ocean, essentially creating areas of constant ocean heat uptake. So we did have a linear ocean heat uptake trend that was not leveling off, but was about on the order of about 2.2 watts per meter squared, translated to top of the atmosphere imbalance. Another feature that we saw in this set of simulations was a deepening of the Amundsen Sea low. So in this figure, the top row is our observations divided by season. The middle row is the historical ensemble, and the bottom row is the SSP scenarios. And the X dot is identified as the center of the Amundsen Sea low, and you see just generally through the color scale that we're getting deeper blue, strengthening of the Amundsen Sea low through the historical and SSP scenario. And both the location and the strength of the Amundsen Sea low has an important impact on on sea ice in the Amundsen Sea and Ross sectors. So this is an important feature that we found. I want to talk a little bit about ice sheet and sea level rise tipping points. I'm glad that animation started right away. So this was one of the tipping points that I had sort of alluded to earlier, and this is a feature that we have seen in our model and other modeling centers have also seen, where under one of the large ice shelves, the Filchnirani ice shelf, which is shown in the inset in the left here, what happens is there's the circumpolar deep water that is sitting below the continental shelf, which is this very warm, salty water mass you're seeing at the beginning of the simulation here. Eventually, as the simulation progresses, if the Antarctic slope front, which is that dashed line that's really holding that warm water mass back, that starts weakening, and we get this warm water intrusion into the ice shelf cavity. That just sort of starts this runaway effect that sends this ice shelf into a high melt regime. And so this is a tipping point that we see in the model. Other models have seen. So it's, how that's tied to reality is, I guess we perhaps won't know until it's too late, but is certainly their concern. Another tipping point in the Antarctic ice sheet is with surface melting. Now, there's generally not very much surface melting in Antarctica presently, but out at the edge of these ice shelves, if surface melting does increase, then it can really degrade the strength of the ice shelf, leading to imminent and quick collapse. And again, as these ice shelves play an outsized role in the importance of the overall mass budget of the Antarctic ice sheet, because they are the features that are really holding back the mass of the ice sheet that is still on land. And on the right here, I have another animation of, now this is the first results from our actual ice sheet model, which is Molly. And so this is from a recent ISMIP comparison that is using climate forcing from CIME models that were run out through 2300 under various SSP scenarios, where the SSPs scenarios themselves were extended out to 2300. And what we see is that essentially on the current trajectory, the current emissions trajectory we're on, that pretty much catastrophic collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet is unavoidable beyond year 2200. And I think this was a robust feature found across the MIPS that had done similar scenarios out through 2300. So this is sort of pointing to the importance of, typically our time horizon in CMIP world is out to 2100, but in the ice sheet community, really interesting and drastic things tend to happen around 2150, 2200. So that was the first Molly simulation that I've shown. The ice sheet component is still in early stages of actually being coupled to the rest of E3SM. And what our group is working on for this phase of the project is really getting an active Greenland ice sheet coupled to the model. The main reason that Greenland is significantly easier than Antarctica in that the ice sheet is generally not marine terminating, so you don't have these ice shelves. The ice sheet will terminate in fjords, but those are not going to be resolved by the ocean model anyway. So it's a much easier boundary conditions between the land and ocean, where you don't have evolving footprints of the ice sheet. So steps towards this Greenland ice sheet coupling is first to run we run a long, I think, 600-year ELM spin up with advanced firn snow physics to get better surface mass balance to validate this, for validation that's going to be used to to force the Greenland ice sheet model. We'll then run standalone offline forced GIS ensemble members where we can use ERA5 forcing as well as some ocean thermal forcing that is derived from MPAS ocean simulations. And finally move on to actual coupled GIS with E3SM, with the rest of E3SM simulations. And so I've just listed some of the additional coupling fields and considerations that to represent some of the technical challenges that are inherent with this work. We need to have the land communicate to GLC is legacy glacier, the code for or short name for the land ice model, to communicate the surface mass balance. The glacier needs to communicate back to land the change in land surface elevation, and ocean needs to communicate to Molly the thermal forcing, and lastly, Molly communicating to the ocean calving fluxes and liquid runoff that come from the ice sheet dynamics. Lastly, I wanted to say a few things about the polar representation in the ongoing V3 simulation campaign. So it's been mentioned earlier that a couple of key bugs and improvements in the sea ice model have been put in place over the course of the development towards V3. And we do see a significant improvement in the representation of sea ice in the model. What I wanted to highlight here is really, so the top row is the V3 PI control that is just recently be finished. And we really see buildup of sea ice along the Canadian archipelago that was noticeably missing in previous iterations of the model. I will point out we do still have a Labrador Sea bias that's really driven by ocean biases, just the ocean being too fresh there, too conducive to sea ice growth conditions, but we'll take wins where we can get them. So this figure was developed by Andrew Roberts of our group, and he calls it the sea ice lemnisc, which lemnisc is Greek for ribbon. And it's a way to visualize the sea ice state, the global sea ice state in one figure. So we typically see figures of either Antarctic or Arctic sea ice. But this is a way to demonstrate what's going on in the full coupled system. So on the horizontal axis is a metric evaluated in the northern hemisphere, and in the vertical axis is the southern hemisphere. And so you can really trace through this lemnisc as you progress through the year. So the sort of edges of the lemnisc are really or correspond to the summer and winter solstice. And the equinoxes correspond to, when either hemisphere is having a maximum or minimum. So on the left, we have the results from a historical V2 ensemble member. Orange in orange is observation and blue is the model. So when the blue curve is far to the right of the left curve, that means we have far too much sea ice in the northern hemisphere. And similarly, when the blue curve is below the orange curve, that means we have too little ice in the Antarctic as compared to observations. And I've picked a couple of the ensemble members to show on the right to show just how much just how things have improved through this global, which we can see in this global metric. On the right, the curves are practically on top of each other for sea ice extent. There's still that bit where the blue curve is at the bottom to the right of the orange curve, and that's really due to the Labrador Sea bias that I was mentioning. I didn't want to cherry pick the best example, so I picked a second ensemble member that doesn't look quite as good in the Antarctic, but still, I think we're very pleased with how things are looking so far. And that's all I have. Any questions? No?
Do we have a path or an idea of how to improve the biases in limited scale?
The Labrador sea bias is been a persistent feature in our system modeling for at least a decade. It's not just us, CIME sees the same thing. And it's kind of it's not really the fault of the sea ice, it's the fault of the conditions around it. And so it's kind of a whack-a-mole where you can get the ocean bias down, the fresh bias down, so that the conditions aren't as conducive to sea ice growth. Well, then the atmosphere may be too cool and promote growth anyways. So it's a tough problem.
It's hard.
Yeah. Chris?
Nice summary of the work. How far or how close are we from having interactive ice shelf in Antarctica? It is beyond V3 or?
Beyond V3. So Antarctic ice sheet coupling is part of an ecosystem project. It's in a SIDAC project. So it's not so that the time scale for that is really V4, possibly even V5. So what we have under E3SM is really responsible for the GIS coupling, which we're aiming to complete in phase 3.
That's for V3.
Yeah. Yes.
So in the coupled version of the Greenland ice sheet coupling, have you get a chance to look at the sea surface temperature around Greenland?
Yes. So that is right now we're using that to develop thermal forcing for the Greenland ice sheet.
Right.
We do have some pretty cool fresh biases immediately around the coast of Greenland. And that's most likely due to the fact that right now, all of the Greenland runoff that's represented in the model is sent directly to the coast. So there's a tremendous amount of solid ice that's being immediately melted by the ocean around the coast, that in reality would be icebergs that's transferring that cold solid water much further away. So we have ocean biases, around Greenland. Yeah.
In those simulations where you showed like the collapse of the ice shelf, that basically half of Antarctica is melting away, are you able to see in the simulations how other processes are impacted, like global rain patterns or temperature?
No, so that is not, so that's a Molly ice sheet standalone simulation that's being forced with model output from other CIME models that were run out to 2300. So that would just be, as far as this is seeing, just in the forcing.
Thank you, Darin.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Susannah Burrows from Pacific Northwest National Lab, and she'll be talking about aerosols.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to give you a quick overview about some of the work that we did. Some of the work we did to help improve the aerosol forcing and therefore improve the simulation of the historical temperature record in the V3 model. And this was a team effort that involved biomicrophysics developers, aerosol developers, and also work on diagnostics. So I want to acknowledge the team of people who contributed to this, as well as the whole atmosphere and coupled groups from the E3SM project. So a little bit of background as to what we are really looking at here. The aerosols, as many of you probably are aware, are one of the major radiative forcers of climate, and humans have emitted a lot of aerosol species over the last 150 years that contribute a significant amount of uncertainty to historical climate change. And because we use the historical climate change, the temperature increase, as a way of evaluating whether the climate model can adequately reproduce the response to climate forcings, there's a combined effect over that time period of both the climate sensitivity of the model, so the response to greenhouse gases, and the response to aerosol forcings. And the two of these together determine to a large extent the path that the historical temperature record takes. And so because of this, the historical temperature record provides a joint top-down constraint in terms of the energy budget on these two terms. So this is a figure that shows what some of the implications are of that. So this is from Watson, Perez, and Smith, Nature Climate Change 2022. And on the x-axis, it's showing the aerosol effective radiative forcing in watts per square meter. On the y-axis, the equilibrium climate sensitivity from a perturbed parameter ensemble. And then what they did in this, they built an emulator and they ran the emulator with various different perturbed physics values. And what they're showing is that if you constrain the aerosol effective radiative forcing, it implies a constraint on the climate sensitivity and vice versa. So you can have values of the effective radiative forcing that are lower, like this blue range, while having a higher, so a stronger aerosol forcing while having a higher climate sensitivity. If you constrain by the historical temperature record, or you can have higher values of effective radiative forcing and lower values of climate sensitivity. So if we were able to reduce the uncertainty in the aerosol effective radiative forcing, it would help to reduce uncertainty in climate sensitivity. And in addition to that, we think that because of this overall top-down constraint, it makes some sense to consider the aerosol effective radiative forcing to be one of the things that we specifically not only evaluate, but perhaps also consider as a calibration target in climate models. And so just to review some terms and make sure everyone's on the same page, when we're talking about an effective radiative forcing, what this means, the definition is that it's a difference in the net top of atmosphere radiative downward flux between two simulations. And for aerosols, the way we quantify that is that we do one simulation where we use present day aerosol emissions and one where we use pre-industrial aerosol emissions. And in both simulations, the sea surface temperature is fixed and everything else, all of the other forcings are the same. And then we look at the difference in the top of atmosphere radiative flux. So this response of the climate to the aerosols includes not only the direct radiative effect of the aerosol radiation interaction, so the absorption and reflection of radiation by the aerosols, but also the adjustments of clouds, as well as the adjustments of water vapor and land surface temperature. And in particular, the cloud adjustment is a very large part of the aerosol effect on climate. And so we distinguish between the direct effects of aerosol, which we call ERF ARI, through direct interactions with radiation, and the indirect effects, the ERF ACI, which is the effects on radiation through interactions with clouds. And this schematic is showing what some of those processes are. So we, as you may know, we have various aerosol species in the model, including some that are very strong absorbers of radiation, like black carbon, and moderate absorbers like dust and organic carbon. And those interact with radiation in different ways, depending on whether they're above clouds or below clouds, where the radiation has been scattered that's coming from the sun. And then we also have aerosols impacting clouds by increasing the number of cloud droplets. And by increasing cloud droplets, they change the lifetime of the clouds and also the amount of sunlight they reflect. So the problem that we had in version 1 and version 2 of E3SM, and you may have seen this figure before earlier this week, was that we had a very strong cooling in the mid-20th century when anthropogenic aerosol emissions are particularly strong. And in the overview paper, Golas et al. 2022, Chris attributed this through single forcing experiments to being caused by the aerosol forcing, and estimated that we would need to reduce the strength of the aerosol forcing to pretty significant degree to somewhere between minus 0.5 to minus 0.7 in our model to match the historical temperature record. And there are essentially two major ways that we can reduce the aerosol forcing, especially the aerosol cloud interaction component, which is the larger term. One is that we can reduce the difference between the amount of aerosol and therefore the amount of cloud droplets in present day and pre-industrial. Remember, we quantify this as a difference between present day and pre-industrial. The second is that we can reduce the sensitivity of clouds to changes in aerosol and in cloud droplet number. And the reason that, so this diagram here is showing kind of a schematic of the processes by which aerosol impacts clouds, which kind of explain why this PDPI difference is so important. So in the upper left, you see that anthropogenic emissions, which include both direct emissions of aerosols and precursor gases, this causes an increase in cloud condensation nuclei. And that's the first step of the process. The second step is that the increase in cloud condensation nuclei leads to an increase in cloud droplet concentration. The third step is that increases in cloud droplet concentration increase the cloud albedo, so the amount of sunlight reflected by clouds in clouds that have the same amount of liquid water, but it's spread over more droplets. Those clouds reflect more sunlight. And then finally, the cloud albedo, if you combine all of those together, you get this last plot, which is showing the link between anthropogenic emissions and cloud albedo. And because at each of these steps, there are processes involved that cause the relationship to be sublinear, overall, you get this very strongly sublinear effect. And some of those processes include, for example, when you are activating cloud droplet, CCN into cloud droplets, the ability to activate cloud condensation nuclei is limited by competition for water vapor. So when you have very high numbers of CCN, you activate fewer of them because you reduce the supersaturation more rapidly. So this is just one example of a buffering effect that leads to this sublinearity. And so if you're in the left-hand side on this bottom right plot, if you're in the left-hand side at very low emissions, like we are in the pre-industrial background atmosphere, you have a very, very strong sensitivity of the overall albedo of clouds to changes in emissions. But if you're at the right-hand side, an increase in emissions of the same amount, so the same difference on the x-axis, leads to a much smaller increase in albedo. And so this is why the difference in regions in particular that are very pristine and then have pollution aerosol added to them, this is particularly important for the aerosol effect through aerosol cloud interactions. So, so that's kind of the background, and this slide is giving an overview of how the ERF of aerosol evolved during the course of our development activities last year as compared against community assessed ranges of what the values should be according to multi-line assessments, including observations and models. And so the observational constraints, multi-model ranges, and IPCC assessed ranges are at the bottom. And at the top, we start with E3SM V1. E3SM V1 had a very strong aerosol effect, minus 1.64, which is kind of within the range of the assessments, but at the edge of it, it would be kind of at the strong end of the range. We also had a slightly positive direct effect, which is inconsistent with the most recent assessments, which say the direct effect should be slightly negative. And then we had a very, very strong indirect effect. In E3SM V2, there was a retuning of the convection and other parts of the model that led to a weakening of the total aerosol effective radiative forcing, mostly due to a weakening of the indirect effect. But we also had a much too strong aerosol, present day aerosol burden. So there was a high bias in the PDPI aerosol difference in V2, which also contributed quite a bit to the overly strong aerosol indirect effect. And then in V3, in the first version in V3, of V3 development, we reduced the aerosol effect to minus 0.9, then it increased a little bit, and then we got it down to minus 0.78. And all of these values here, finally, in the end, we have a direct effect and indirect effect that are all within the ranges that the community agrees are possible. So what did we do to arrive at those differences? This is just a summary of the main changes we made that impacted the aerosol effective radiative forcing. During the development from V2 up to our first development version last February, there was a new cloud microphysics scheme introduced, which actually increased the strength of the radiation of the aerosol effect initially. We increased the lower bound on the droplet number concentration, and then also retuned the autoconversion, which is the formation of warm rain, and made improvements to the wet removal processes, which helped to reduce the PDPI aerosol difference and the overestimation of anthropogenic aerosol. So that got us down to this minus 0.9, which gave us actually a really beautiful simulation of the historical temperature record with that version. After that, we found a problem where changing from one machine to another significantly increased the strength of the aerosol forcing. So it took a little while to figure out this machine dependency issue. And there were also some changes to the aerosol and chemistry schemes that were added, which had minor effects on the aerosol forcing. And then finally, in October, we made a few more changes. We increased the background CCN to reduce this PDPI aerosol difference. We retuned the autoconversion again, and we increased the aging speed for black carbon and the hygroscopicity of particulate organic matter, which means that it's removed through wet removal more rapidly. So after all of those changes in version 3, we ended up with an overall ERF of minus 0.75. And this indeed gave us a much cleaner, much better simulation of the historical temperature record when combined, of course, with other changes in the coupled model. And so we're very pleased that we were able to get a good simulation of the historical temperature record. This is really important for the credibility of the model. We're currently doing more analysis to quantify some of the specific mechanisms by which the aerosols changed and how they're affecting this temperature change. Yes, and then also I wanted to show here that this improvement in the agreement is really mainly in the northern hemisphere, so that's consistent with it being due to an anthropogenic signal from the aerosol. So I do also want to emphasize that the effective radiative forcing is not the only metric that we look at in terms of analyzing whether the aerosol in our model is realistic. We have a whole suite of additional diagnostics, many of which we developed and implemented during the last year and a half in order to support this effort. And so we're looking also at the mean climate state, mean climatology, comparisons against surface networks, comparisons against satellite data, cloud albedo susceptibility diagnostics, and a variety of other things. And most of these diagnostics that I'm listing here either are already available inside of the E3SM Diags suite or will be eventually released as part of that suite or as part of other published tool sets. So with that, I'm going to just end my talk by coming back to the point I made at the beginning, which is that we do have these joint impacts of aerosol and climate sensitivity on the energy budget. And because of that, we think that's an argument for why it can be justifiable to systematically or intentionally calibrate ERF air to get a good agreement with the historical temperature. Although this is a bit controversial in the community, that I think there is a strong case to be made for why that is a justifiable thing to do. And by doing that, we were able to achieve a better agreement with historical temperature record while also bringing our aerosol forcing in line with community assessments and best estimates from observations. So that's the end of my talk.
That was really interesting. Have any of those runs included the DMS from the VGC? Marine BGC, or is there plans to do that?
So we do have DMS emissions and, but they're not interactively linked to the ocean UGC at the moment. That is something we have thought about doing. But at this time, we use prescribed DMS ocean surface concentrations, and then the sea air transfer is wind driven by a piston velocity parameterization. And so what we did, one of the things that we did was that we, because we know that the emissions and the ocean concentrations are pretty uncertain. So these are based on observations from ships of the ocean surface concentrations in the water of DMS. And then they've been, well, in our case, kind of incorporated into an ocean BGC model that was used to produce those fields, but it's highly uncertain.
Okay.
And so we felt that it's probably uncertain to within a factor of 2. And so we've doubled the emissions, or not the emissions, but the DMS concentrations, which effectively doubles the emissions, which gives us this higher background CCN. Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I'm very excited to see the improvement on the aerosol forcing, but at the same time, I'm just curious because there's a lot of tuning on the microphysics, for example, like auto conversion.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether we have an estimation about how the precipitation bias will change of those tuning.
Yes. So this has been looked at, but I, off the top of my head, don't have the answer to that. I don't know if Chris might know, or, but we are certainly looking at precipitation as well when we do these tunings. It's also affected by, precipitation is also affected by many other things in the model at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, of course.
The project I'm working on, we're looking a lot at the conversion of like sulfur dioxide into sulfates, and obviously like a large chunk of that involves like interaction with hydroxyl radicals. Just curious, how is OH treated in this model?
That is an excellent question. So in previous versions of the model, we used prescribed OH concentrations that came from some earlier model simulations, I think, that were done with a version of the CIME model. In version 3, we have a prognostic chemistry scheme that has 31 advected tracers in it. So it's the UCI chemistry scheme that is mainly designed for simulation of ozone in particular, but it also simulates OH, and we are coupling that to the sulfate chemistry in version 3. So the oxidation is driven by this prognostic OH tracer, which, as you know, OH concentrations are extremely difficult to observe because of its extremely short lifetime. So it's not an easy field to evaluate in a robust way in the model, but we did compare kind of the mean vertical profiles of OH against estimates that have been made based on observations, and the new chemistry scheme seems to produce more realistic OH concentrations than the prescribed oxidants we were using before, especially in the upper troposphere, where we had OH that was about an order of magnitude too high previously. So
were those prescribed coming from the community emissions data set, you know? CEDS?
No, they came from model simulations, so that because they're three-dimensional fields. So SEDS just, and OH is not really an emitted tracer. It's just a short-lived oxidant. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that it's controversial to try to tune What is the controversy?
So it is, there are different perspectives in the community, I would say, about this. Because there is a school of thought that the aerosol effects on climate are one of the things that we aim to predict, of course, in the model, so that it should be an emergent property. So so one school of thought is we should try to get all of the processes right. And then when we have all of the processes right, we simulate the aerosol radiative effects, especially including the ERF-ACI, as an emergent behavior. On the other hand, we also have this top-down constraint of the energy budget. So if we simulate the processes, and the processes are uncertain. So the processes, there is a degree to which, for example, we don't know the strength of the total overall strength of the precipitation suppression and what that should be, especially when averaged across grid boxes GCM resolution, where you have a lot of subgrid cloud processes that are not resolved. And so there's a range over which it's justifiable to tune or calibrate certain parameters inside of the model because we don't know what their exact values are. And so we do know that we need to meet this energy budget constraint. And so because of that, we feel like some tuning is justifiable within these ranges to meet the energy budget constraint. On the other hand, ideally, it would be great if we had the ability to represent all the physics faithfully and with fidelity, with sufficiently small uncertainty that we could have confidence that we knew what the right answer should be without needing to calibrate it. But because of all the challenges with this, so this is like a multi-scale process where you're going from these small CCN droplet activation processes all the way up through cloud scales, which, if we wanted to really be able to simulate clouds, we would need a resolution of like 100 meters. And we're simulating at 100-kilometer grid box sizes. So it's, we have to make some compromises.
That makes sense. I was partially asking because those observational constraints, the Bellin and Smith, they come from energy budget constraints.
That's right, yeah.
They don't come from process. The emergent constraints on those are like -4. It's ultimately still matching global temperature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination. I think that the direct effect estimates are more bottom up because because
The upper, we can talk about.
yeah. Okay, maybe we need to move on.
Sorry to cut off this last, but if you have any questions for Susannah, we'll have the lunch break next and you can sit with her and talk some more. But thank you, Susannah. Next up, we have Walter Hanna talking about improvements in the QBO.
Back. I'm actually gonna not talk about the QBO as much as I'm gonna talk about the vertical grid in the atmosphere. But it turns out the changes we made here had a big impact on the QBO and V3. So yeah, one of my motivations here is I kind of want to demystify the vertical grid and make sure everyone understands what it is, how it works, how to use it. It's important to understand that the vertical coordinate in the atmosphere is this hybrid between terrain following and pure pressure. And the way that these are blended is done with these two coefficients, A and B. So if you look at this equation down at the bottom here, you can get the kind of true pressure at any point in the atmosphere by this combination of the A times the reference pressure plus B times the surface pressure. So the part multiplying the surface pressure is the terrain following kind of portion of the coordinate. And this plot up here kind of shows you how they're blended together. So if you add them together, you get kind of a straight line. And the fact that B goes to 1 here is showing you that it's pure pressure, or sorry, pure terrain following near the surface, right? And then it kind of transitions to where it's pure pressure up here. So above 200 millibars or so, you can actually, whatever the vertical coordinate level is, actually is the pressure value. But anywhere else in the troposphere, you'll get a Lev coordinate value that looks like pressure, and approximately it is, but it's not the actual pressure that the model's using. So yeah, I think this is one of those things that a lot of people don't understand, and they don't really need to understand it because it doesn't matter for most things. So this is what the vertical grid kind of looks like. The actual vertical grid, the levels we've chosen. And this is from V1 and V2. And so you can kind of see that this plot is a little weird, mainly because the axes are not independent. So here I've got the kind of approximate pressure level on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, I've got the approximate grid spacing in a different unit in altitude. So it's dz versus pressure. But if you were to change dz, like if you were to take a point and move it over and make it thicker, you would push all the points up. So it's a weird plot. Keep that in mind. But yeah, you can, the nice thing about this plot is you can see how the resolution of the vertical grid has this kind of stair stepping. And if you look down the inset here, you can see right near the surface, it's actually like 20 meters or less effectively right near the surface, which actually exacerbates oscillations at the physics time step of the atmosphere with the fluxes. So you'll get kind of the friction and the wind going back and forth overlaid on the real signal. And part of the reason for that is because the atmosphere is so thin there, which was intentional when this grid was designed. But another odd thing about this grid is that it's not documented anywhere. It was designed through a series of emails between a handful of people, and they don't even really remember why they made the decisions that they made. I won't name them. They know who they are. But and I've given them a lot of flack for it over the years. So I've been pushing to change the vertical grid for years now, and someone finally listened and agreed with me, which is nice. But they didn't want me to change anything below the tropopause. So so the blue grid there is the one we're using in V3, which has 80 levels. And you can see here that it's finer here, kind of above the tropopause. And then it's smoother as you go up. But everything below that is identical. And if you change anything, well, you can change a little bit there in the upper troposphere. But if you change anything in the lower troposphere of the boundary layer, the climate goes completely haywire. All your clouds look different. Your cloud feedbacks are very different. And the main reason of that is because the deep convection scheme is very, very sensitive to where the levels are placed, because it picks, like when it launches the parcel, it picks an integer value of the level that it's going to launch from, rather than interpolating to some sort of point in the boundary layer. So in V1 and V2, we've always had trouble with the QBO. And the QBO is driven by gravity waves. Partly that's due to convective scale gravity waves that are always going to be parameterized in a model like this, but also it's driven by synoptic gravity waves, like Kelvin waves and mixed Rossby gravity waves are the main contributors. And when they are propagating through this area of the tropopause, they have vertical wavelengths of as low as 200 or 300 meters. And since our vertical grid spacing here in the lower stratosphere was getting to 1,000 meters very quickly, it's obvious to expect that the QBO just wouldn't be able to exist because those waves are being filtered out by the grid spacing. So that was the rationale for refining this area in the lower stratosphere. And just for fun, I'll tell you how I did this, because I have a bunch of these algorithms now, which they're kind of fun to design these sort of things. You just get to play around with moving them around and trying to conserve various things. So in this case, I had to preserve the model top. I couldn't touch the levels in the troposphere. So what I did, starting with the L72 grid, I basically reset all the spacing of the levels here and kind of collected all the residual thickness in this one point. And then I iteratively bisected that down. So here's one step of that, bisecting a level. And then you end up with this very jagged grid here in the red, once you've restored monotonicity of the spacing. And then you just use a simple smoother and you get a nice looking vertical grid. So when you do that, I've got the observed QBO on the top here, and then the L72 lack of QBO in the middle. All of a sudden, the QBO just emerges because you're not filtering out these synoptic waves anymore. We have a postdoc who's working on a paper that shows this and kind of shows how the different wave contributions are increased by this. And so it's pretty convincing. And then we do a little bit of tuning in the actual V3. This is actually V2 with the L80 grid in the bottom here. Yeah, once you tune that a little bit, the amplitude gets more in line with observations. The period's not quite there yet. I think some other changes need to happen to make that really match better. But it's a huge improvement. You also get the same improvement if you do it on the MMF. So even though the clouds and the convective gravity waves are very different, improving the synoptic gravity waves through this change yields pretty much the identical result. Oh yeah, this kind of shows that here. So on the left, you have FFT of the zonal wind, and the observations there are in black. So the QBO has a period of about 28 months. I guess I didn't explain what the QBO was. I assumed you guys knew what that was. But yeah, the QBO is quasi-biennial oscillation, and it's this right, this is terrible. I just assumed you knew what this plot was. But yeah, this is the zonal wind averaged over a tropical belt from 5 south to 5 north. And the QBO is this descending pattern of the zonal mean wind. And it's gravity waves that are breaking at the bottom of each of these phases that cause it to move down. So yeah, so it has a period of about 28 months, which you can kind of see in this FFT plot over here. And the MMF is shown in green, and the E3SM V2 with L80 is shown in orange. And so you can see the period is not quite right here, and the dashed lines are the control cases with the default grids that aren't refined enough. And on the right here, this is a amplitude, basically kind of summing up all the amplitude between 20 and 40 months on this plot. You get this amplitude profile. And again, it's just showing how much closer it is to observations. Another deficiency I think is kind of interesting is that the QBO doesn't propagate down far enough. It kind of starts diminishing too soon, and it starts too high. I'm not really sure how to fix that yet, but it's an active area research. Oh yeah, this is a little bit that kind of shows the processes driving the QBO and how they're affected. Can I minimize this thing on my screen? Yeah, oh, there we go, okay. So yeah, so in the top here, we've got Era 5 data, and this is the Wheeler-Colades diagram like we've seen before, which is often, I feel like you most often see it when talking about tropical variability. But here we're in the stratosphere and we're looking at the 50 hectopascal zonal wind. And so where you see the power here, this is indicative of how much synoptic wave activity is being resolved at this level. And when you compare the default and the refined here, it's a bit hard to see, but in this Kelvin wave band here, you can tell there's more power there because we're not filtering those waves. They're getting up higher into the stratosphere. And same here, this is the mixed Rossby gravity wave area, and you can tell that it's slightly higher. So this is kind of proof that we actually have improved the synoptic waves through a simple change in resolution and nothing else. Yeah, so the vertical grids, if this is something you ever want to play around with, it's pretty simple to, well, I shouldn't say simple, it's straightforward to kind of generate these or modify them. And I have a couple examples here of things I've tried in recent years. On the left here are some grids I've used in the MMF. The green one was an experiment with constant stretching. In the middle is something we're playing around with for this QBO project, where I put in this layer of very strong refinement, kind of bracketing the tropopause. to see how that changes the wave propagation. And then on the right here, I mentioned the other day in my talk about the MMF, how you can kind of brute force low clouds to develop in marine stratocumulus areas. And these are the grids that I use to do that. So I've zoomed, the blue here is the L80 grid, kind of zoomed in. And you can see that the spacing of these two grids is much, much finer. So you can resolve a very sharp inversion over the cloud layer, as well as explicitly resolve the turbulence in the boundary layer. So you're kind of getting to LES scales there. So yeah, the way that I generate these grids, I just have some Python code that with a bunch of simple functions. I'm happy to share these if anybody wants to try any of this stuff. But going back to how the L72 grid was generated, there was it wasn't reproducible. And that always bothered me. So I've come up with this way to have kind of a recipe where you start out with this list of approximate spacing and height. So in this case, I have a DK list, which is showing 6 levels of 100 meters, followed by 6 levels of 200 meters, blah, 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 blah. And then you expand that into a list of heights. And then you can convert that using this climatological curve fit between height and approximate height, approximate pressure. And then I have a routine to calculate the coefficient you need for the hybrid. So if you put all these things together and you do some code magic, you can make whatever shape of grid you want. Yeah, so that's all I've got. Hopefully that's demystified how the vertical coordinate works. And take any questions if you guys have any.
So for the clouds, is it for one location or is it the same on this place?
Yeah, so for the way that we visualize it here, if you go back to the formula here, you're basically putting in a reference pressure for surface pressure so that you can think about this as being kind of a representative structure of the grid everywhere. Right, so like this pressure value that you calculate, if you just put the reference pressure here, is what you get here. And this is basically what you get in the model output, in the Lev coordinate, because it'll be these values, but they don't actually represent anywhere on the globe. And it's not like a global average of the coordinate. It's just assuming that the surface pressure is the reference pressure and then multiplying by these coefficients. That's how you get the Lev coordinate.
Great talk. I was thinking about the QBO issue you were mentioning. And I know you were comparing to Aero 5 as the solution, but I know Aero 5 uses 137 vertical levels, right? So I'm just curious if you threw more vertical levels at E3SM, if you think you would move that.
Well, yeah, so that's exactly that was one of the motivations to do this grid in the middle here. Like if we just add a ton where we think it really matters, that has been running right now. So I don't know if it'll work. But recently I've also talked about this idea about the limitation of the QBO here, where it doesn't propagate down far enough, might be due to the fact that the tropopause is too high and the stability in this area is a bit too high. But that doesn't really explain why it starts out too strong above. So yeah, I think it's more complicated than that.
And I know you're not supposed to do this, but we're talking about not throwing any more vertical levels in the boundary layer. I don't know. I don't have a big question about this, but I'm just curious, like, would that ever be sought out eventually, or is it literally the convections?
Yeah, so I think, one way I played around with this a lot, and I did this one test where I was kind of injecting levels in the troposphere and then going down and seeing how bad it got as you injected them farther down. And if you stay above the first 10 levels, the effect is very minimal. But I think either way, even if you just change the whole vertical grid, I think you could tune away the problems. It's just that that's such a big task, right? It's a big ask to restructure the model just so you have a nicer vertical grid. But there are other benefits, like, with these surface oscillations that occur, there are times when they seem to contribute to instabilities. And they don't really seem to matter for the climate, but you gotta wonder, like maybe like locally they do matter. So for the questions like that, it's worth exploring these things, but the tuning issue is just kind of a blockade, so. I don't know.
I have one question for the vertical grid profile. It's kind of like the tangent H function. So you have two coefficients in the equation. So I just wondering, can we use the tangent H function to fit this profile? So there will be only one coefficient for this hybrid. You have
well,
so if you use tangent H to fit this profile. So only
you're talking about this profile.
yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about using like a series of sigmoids and things like that, but this profile and this distribution of A's and B's, you can kind of think of as separate things. Like you can define the shape of the grid before you defined the distribution of A's and B's and the cutoff between pure pressure and blended coordinates. So, so yes, you can do that in this context. But in the other context, it does need to be a linear combination of two things in order to get the benefits of the hybrid.
Because my hypothesis. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's very nice to see, like say, increased vertical resolution, then you can have better handle in the wave activity. You say the QBO tied to can have associated with the enhanced mixed velocity wave, gravity velocity wave, and Kelvin wave. And those, like saying the signal originated from the troposphere. You don't change on that. I can imagine, like say, if we propagate into the stratosphere and before wave breaking, they will maintain the wave propagation. So how this change in the vertical resolution think back to this kind of physical mechanism, that when the wave going to be break or indirectly reflected to some additional parameterization in the structure.
Yeah, so it doesn't change the parameterized waves. It doesn't appear to change the behavior of the parameterized waves at all, except that it changes where they break because with the QBO present, then the shear is changing and then that'll change where it gets deposited, right? It'll change where the critical level is at any given time. But it's a bit more complicated than that too, because there's evidence that there's in situ wave generation in the stratosphere. So even though the wave activity is changing, and likely a lot of it is propagating up from the troposphere. That's probably not all of it. And so the way I've been thinking about it, it's really just about for both of those things, enhancing the vertical grid is allowing either of those processes to exist, however they're going to exist, right? And you think like in V3, the tropical wave spectrum is much better than V2. These results are all V2. But looking in V3, it's not all that much different. The QBO behaves about the same. And so it seems like, yeah, the change in the tropospheric wave activity doesn't have that big of an impact like you might expect it to, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So there's probably some like say in situ in generation for the wave, because when I say the intense wave propagating from down below, yeah, I was thinking V3. Yeah, you are right.
Yeah.
Thank you all. And last but not least, we have Peter Caldwell talking about ML and climate modeling.
Right. Thanks a lot. So this is a topic I have a lot of opinions about. And it's also a topic that anytime someone comes up with an opinion, they're usually proven wrong in a couple of months. So take this with a grain of salt and hopefully just use it to spur your own thinking about, wow, that was a dumb idea. I think the opposite or something like that. So jumping into it, just to make sure we're kind of on the same level, and also because I feel like most definitions of machine learning or ML seem to fit. And so I wanted to include my own example that ended up getting a little bit unwieldy, and I think is actually probably my first science poem. And so to start off, instead of being magic, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to optimize uncertain parameters in empirical equations that were purpose-built for being really good at having a lot of flexibility, having a lot of these parameters for us to fiddle with, and are also really good in terms of usually being able to work with an optimization strategy. And so that's the second line, is that we're going to optimize these things with clever cost minimization strategies. So basically trying to have our training data agree, our predictions agree really well with our training data, right? And something that I think is not often pointed out, but is actually really obvious, is that we are, AI is this huge thing right now because computers have advanced to the point where they're really good at, if we give them a guess, they're really good at checking. And so machine learning is all about really fast guessing and checking in the computers that we have these days. And so, AI is taking over the world, it's taking over climate modeling to some extent as well. But I think that there's a real issue with using AI in climate modeling. And the reason is that AI is really good at interpolating, by which I mean if you have a bunch of data and you want to look at something that's already within your data set. So for example, weather forecasting, if I want to predict the weather tomorrow or next week, really I'm sampling from a statistical distribution that we have a lot of samples from already, right? Like the weather next week is going to be very, very similar to the weather we've seen for the last couple of years. So interpolation, weather forecasting, that's something that, I think is a slam dunk for machine learning. But climate modeling, even though we often use the exact same models, at least physical models for doing it, is kind of theoretically totally different in the sense that we are extrapolating, in that we are trying to make predictions with our climate models of a world that we've never seen before. We have no training data of it, right? And so I've created this example at the bottom where I have some training data points in blue. And so you can say, it really looks like it all fits a line. And so if I want to pick a point that is, if I want to find the Y value associated with an X value that's maybe in the middle of my data set, I can do that with pretty good confidence, right? As long as we think that our data is continuous in some sense. And you might also think that you can extrapolate, so go off the end of the data set and do the same thing, right? Like it's probably going to lie along this line, except really when it comes down to it, you actually have no information about what's happening off the outside of your data set. And so in this case, I chose like an absolute value. And so, our prediction along the line would just be completely wrong. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about machine learning. A lot of people use it for like hole filling kind of applications, but I think you have to ask yourself, do you really know what's in that hole? Because if not, then it's just making something up. And so as a result, even though weather forecasting models, climate models, basically the same thing, I think that the way that we know that we're getting the right answer is completely different, right? Like, I don't care if my weather forecast model is just made up of a bunch of gibberish, if it always gives me the right answer, right? That's all I care about. But for a climate model, we really need to, the thing that matters is that it's based on physical laws that we trust, and in particular that we've thought carefully enough about to know that those laws are going to hold in the future, right? So I'm talking about things like the Navier-Stokes equations, Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, things like that, that we know how they work. And so you might be thinking at this point, well, so much for this talk, I guess it's over now, but that's not true. There are actually, in my opinion, a lot of really good uses for machine learning in climate modeling. I actually think it's going to be essential for us to take the next step and provide better predictions in the future. And so the ideas that I came up with, I'm sure that there's more, are one, full model emulation. And so I said before that, that the weather forecasting models that we have, the AI weather forecasting models, they do something intrinsically different. We shouldn't be using them for extrapolation. which I think is true when we're training them on observational data, right? But we can do something a little bit different. We can use those same models, but instead of training them on observations, we can train them on our climate model, right? And so the benefit of this is that the AI-based models are usually a lot faster and more efficient. And so if you're trying to run something like a kilometer scale global atmosphere model, you can only afford to do 20 years or so with your physics-based model, but you can do thousands of years with if you have an AI emulation of the same thing, right? So there's kind of a big difference there. It's a little bit subtle. Talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. You can also do the same thing with single parameterization within your model. Another thing that's kind of a very different use is what's called auto tuning. So you all probably know now that there are lots of uncertain physical constants in our climate models. And so we usually come up with optimum values of those by thinking hard about it, basically doing a bunch of simulations. But I think it's kind of an obvious statement that this is something that machine learning could help us out with a lot, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Another use that I think is getting quite popular is downscaling. So you run your conventional low resolution climate model, but you want to be able to say what's happening at a very fine scale. And so you can use the relationship between a fine resolution data set and then a coarsened version of it in order to do some sort of mapping between the two. And I think that's going to be really important as well. I'm also really excited about data compression, in particular with the item number one. Full model emulation requires a ton of data. It's like every 3 hours, usually 3D. And so the only way that we can get that at high resolution is by doing something clever with data compression. And then finally, analysis. So dealing with your output and your model output, there's a ton of different uses in terms of classifying different cases and things like that. So zooming in a little bit more, let's see, so I probably said all this. Yeah, so we can just use these full model emulation codes that a lot of places like NVIDIA and Google and things like that have come up with for weather forecasting. We can use the same thing, but just trained on our models. I think a really critical thing to keep in mind here is that our emulator, in this case, is never going to be better than our physical model. We can't get rid of the physical model because that's the thing that we trust, right? And if there's a bias in our physical model, our emulator is always going to have it as well, right? So there is a benefit, but it's not going to be a panacea. It's not going to give us the perfect answer. It just gives us longer range predictions, basically. Yeah, and then, so I've been working on this, doing this for a couple of years now. And what I found that I hadn't appreciated is that if you take like a 3-kilometer global model and you try to come up with an emulator for it, well, you'll fail. And there's two reasons for that. One is that these things usually take something like 30 years of 3-hourly or 6-hourly data, a lot of 3D fields, and you just can't save that, right? It's like billions of petabytes of data, which is why I'm excited about data compression. So that's one issue. But then the other issue is even if you had all that data, training a model with that many free parameters, well, it's just not possible probably anytime soon. And so what folks are doing instead is you take your 3-kilometer model, you use the coarsening I talked about yesterday, so you write your output at like 100 kilometers, you run your emulator at 100 kilometers, and then you use downscaling at the end in order to get back to the high resolution, which seems a little bit circuitous. It seems like you're kind of leaving information on the table, but it works, and the other approach doesn't right now. So if you have a better way to do it, I'm all ears, but that's what we're doing right now. Okay, and so then I want to talk a little bit about what happens when you emulate just a single process, which is also really popular. And so, you can do this to just speed up your model like we talked about before. It's often also used in order to allow us to bring in a much more sophisticated model than we could otherwise afford, maybe a higher resolution model. So like a large eddy simulation or a bin resolved microphysics scheme, something like that. So that's great. Something that you should be careful of when you go with this kind of approach is that usually it works great when you're doing the machine learning offline, right? So you're able to predict what the tendencies from that process is really well. But then a lot of times when you run, you add this into your E3SM code and you run it, it runs great for a while and then it just blows up, right? And this is kind of unsurprising because remember, machine learning isn't very good at extrapolation. And so if the physical model passes your machine learning a state that's a little bit weird, it's never seen before, it's going to return back to the physical model a state that's even weirder, which then is going to cause a resonance and cause things to crash. So something to keep in mind. There are a lot of successful examples of this out there, but I have the slogan that don't show me your machine learning parameterization until you run it stably in a climate model for a while, because otherwise it's probably not practically useful. Okay, and then so the third thing that I've been working on is the auto tuning I talked a little bit about before. Just one thing that I think is interesting is like, how do you do it, right? Like in a sense, this auto tuning, you have uncertain parameters in your model, and you want to figure out what the optimal value to agree with observations is. This is like my definition of machine learning in general, right? It's like, this is the intrinsic machine learning case. But there's something challenging with this particular case in that you want to run your climate model for all of these different guesses at what the optimal set of parameters are. And your climate model is really expensive to run, right? Like you've seen this, you've probably known this for a long time. And so what ends up generally happening in this field is that you first come up with an emulator for your climate model, instead of emulating this time step by time step behavior of the model. You usually emulate the model's climatology, so like the time mean average of the model behavior as a function of the uncertain parameters you have. And then you use some sort of optimization methodology of gradient descent or something in order to get the optimum values of the parameters from that. And then you have to go back and actually do a model simulation with your optimal values, just to make sure that there wasn't a disconnect between your emulator and the actual model you're trying to predict. So this is something that we've done with Screen recently, and I was surprised at how hard it was. And so there are not many operational centers that are using machine learning to do their tuning, even though there's a lot of projects that are trying to do that, right? So I think something that I hadn't fully appreciated is that this is really hard to do. One great counterexample is the most recent GIS model was tuned with AI, and there is supposed to be a paper coming out someday about it. It's like 3 years late or something. So, as all the great papers. And so that leaves me with my takeaways that I think I already said, so I'll just take questions. Walter.
This thing about the emulators being so unstable, I'm on a project that's having this exact same problem. And I keep suggesting that really the training data should overemphasize the tails, like you should freeze the oceans and then make them boil and then train on that. And then hopefully it'll get somewhere in the middle. Because I think there is some paper showing that you can get the 2 times CO2 if you train on the 4 times and the 1 time. So yeah, I mean, what's your opinion of that? Do you think that's promising, or do you think that's still kind of a fool's errand?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly the right thing, right? Like it all comes back to this interpolation versus extrapolation thing, right? Like that you really need to get way more training data for way more weird conditions just to make sure you're not doing the extrapolation that the model does a terrible job at. So yeah, I think so. I guess I would say in general that if you have a case where you can get training data for any conceivable situation that your model might hit, that then you're probably going to have a lot of good luck in replacing that parameterization with your machine learning. But if not, just seems like conceptually, you're probably gonna run into problems.
So you mentioned, using machine learning on, I guess, 3 kilometer, 1 kilometer, whatever kilometer scale model.
Yeah.
Is that, when you run, like, let's say you train on your 10 years of 1 kilometer data, and then you run with the machine learning, digital twin, whatever the word we use now is, and you run out for another 1,000 years. Is that really just capturing that same 10-year period and kind of getting different permutations of probably the same climate, or is it that you said it's not really extrapolating? So
yeah, that is the $1 million question. I think, so specifically, to kind of expand on what you're saying, if I have 10 years of data, am I going to get centennial scale oscillations in the climate and variability? I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. I'm really excited about trying it. The challenge is that so far, not all of the emulators. I think that Dale Duran has one that he's recently run in coupled mode, but most of them, the one that I'm using so far, it's just an atmosphere only mode. And so that variability that we really want to explore, that is kind of essential to the hypothesis, we haven't been able to test yet. So yeah, but great question.
Thanks for the talk. Just a couple of comments. First one on the question about trying to just capture the extremes of a distribution. I think you probably want to put some resources also capturing the middle of the distribution. So just comment on that. And then to play devil's advocate about the plot where you had the absolute value stuff, that could also be true about climate models as well, right? Like, we don't know what future climates might hold, but we kind of optimize parameters for historical periods. So we don't know if that's going to be true in the future. So just to be like an advocate for machine learning, that, it's kind of the same in the climate model space as well.
Yeah, those are both really good points. And I think, I agree with your second point that climate models might be getting it totally wrong because we're training them just on the current climate. I think that instead of saying that means machine learning is good, I think that means that we have more work to do in our physical models, right? I still believe that the way that we trust our physical models is because we understand what they're doing and we know that they're going to behave properly in a future climate. And so, that you're right that we often just tune to the current climate. And if we're not careful about how we do that, we should be tuning to the current climate in a way that emphasizes things like we want to get the diurnal cycle right. We want to get the seasonal cycle right. Things that actually show response to forcing rather than just I can make a perfect climate model that just repeats the weather of each day that we've had in the history and then just continues doing the same thing into the future. It's going to be a terrible climate model because it's not going to get climate change at all, but it could be potentially a perfect weather forecast, perfect historical forecast. So I don't know, there's probably more than you meant me to say, but yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. So Google released their GraphCast at the end of last year. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned you have opinions of this. I wondered, what is your view of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that GraphCast has been amazing for weather forecasting and really, yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. I think that the trajectory for weather forecasting seems very different. One thing that I think is interesting, I haven't quite sorted out myself in that context is, so right now, it seems like all the weather forecasting AI is training off of ERA5, which is a physically based model, right? But if we switch all of our eggs into the basket of AI, are we still going to have ERA5 to train off of in the first place, right? And so, I don't think that there's any intrinsic reason why we couldn't just start training directly off of current climate observations, but that it hasn't happened yet, and I think is maybe a shift or another revolution that needs to happen, and that's going to split climate and weather more than it is now. So I don't know if that answers your question, but. Okay.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so thank you to all the speakers in the morning.